Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The thought arrived not as a memory, but as a stain seeping up from a floorboard in his mind he hadn't known was loose. It was a specific, visceral sensation, the gritty friction of cold, damp soil packed tight under his fingernails, not from digging, but from holding on, from clinging to the earth as if it might slide out from under him. Brooks blinked, his hiking boots scuffing against the pine needle carpet of the trail, and the feeling vanished, leaving only a phantom chill in his fingertips. He looked at his hands, clean and calloused from work, and felt a stranger-esque panic flutter behind his ribs. Ahead of him, Kyler walked with the easy, rolling gait of a man who belonged in the world, his backpack a familiar hump on his broad shoulders. "You keeping up back there, Professor?" Kyler called over his shoulder, his voice a warm, teasing baritone that carried through the cathedral quiet of the ancient woods. It was a voice that had calmed Brooks through 100 childhood fears, a voice that promised order and safety. But today, it felt like a performance. Just admiring the scenery, Brooks lied, his own voice sounding thin and reedy in comparison. To his right, Maya laughed, a bright, musical sound that seemed to startle the silence. "Admiring the back of Kyler S. head, you mean? It S the same ferns and pines we've been seeing for 6 hours." She was the compass of the group, their cartographer, her fingers now tracing the contour lines on the map with a certainty Brooks envied. And behind them, lagging a few paces as always, was Jax. He moved like a shadow, quiet and fluid, his camera a permanent extension of his hands. He didn't speak, but Brooks could feel the weight of his gaze, a constant, unspoken judgment that had become the background radiation of their friendship. This was the annual trip, the sacred pact they made after college to never let life pull them completely apart. 4 friends in the deep, untamed wilderness of the North Cascades, a place Kyler had chosen for its raw beauty and its absolute removal from the traffic jams and spreadsheet prisons of their lives. But the tension was there, a fine crack running through the porcelain glaze of their camaraderie. It had been there since the incident with Jack's S exhibition, since Brooks' S quiet betrayal that everyone knew about and no one mentioned. The woods, meant to heal them, only seemed to amplify the silence between their words. The air grew heavier as they descended into a narrow valley, the map called Silent Creek. The name was apt. The cheerful chatter of birds from the sun-dappled ridges above died away, replaced by the low, persistent groan of the wind through a stand of skeletal, lightning-blasted hemlocks. The light took on a thick, greenish quality, filtered through a canopy so dense it felt like being underwater. The scent was no longer just pine and clean decay. It was wet stone and something else, something metallic and old, like the smell of a long-forgotten cellar or a handful of pennies. It was Jax who found the first stone, He had strayed from the path, as was his habit, his photographer's eye drawn to the unnatural symmetry hidden among the ferns. He didn't call out. He simply stood, staring down at a flat, dark slab of rock that had been cleared of moss and lichen. Carved into its surface was a spiral, but it was a wrong spiral. The lines didn't flow in a smooth, hypnotic curve. They were jagged, interrupted by sharp angles and hooks, as if the symbol itself were a trap. "What is it?" Maya asked, coming to stand beside him. Her confident posture had tightened. Kyler strode over, his boots crunching loudly. "Some old logging marker, probably. Or kids messing around." He tapped the stone with his toe. "Don't go wandering off, Jax. We need to make the campsite before dark." But Brooks couldn't look away from the spiral. It seemed to pull at his vision, to twist the light around it. The memory stain returned, stronger this time. Not just the dirt under his nails, but the taste of it, earthy and cold on his tongue. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a sense of profound, gravitational wrongness, as if the stone were not just a marker, but a plug, and something was pressing up against it from the other side. They found the campsite an hour later, a small clearing by a stream that was indeed utterly silent. The water moved, a dark, tea-colored flow, but it made no sound as it slipped over the smooth, black stones. It was deeply unsettling. The absence of the stream's babble felt like a violation of a fundamental law. They set up their tents in a strained quiet, the rustle of nylon and the thud of stakes being driven into the unyielding ground, the only sounds. That night, the dreams came for Brooks. He was digging, his hands raw and bleeding, but he wasn't digging a hole. He was digging his way out of one. Above him, a circle of faces peered down, their features blurred and indistinct, but he knew them. They were his friends, and they were not trying to help him. They were waiting for him to finish. The soil in his mouth was the taste of the symbol, of the silent water, of the woods themselves. He woke with a gasp, the inside of the tent swimming in pre-dawn gray. The air was frigid, and from outside, carried on the still air, came a sound that stopped his heart. It was a low, rhythmic chanting. Not words, but guttural syllables, a language of stones grinding together and roots tearing free. It was ancient, and it was close. He unzipped his tent with a trembling hand. The fire was dead. Kyler was standing at the edge of the clearing, his back to the campsite, staring into the impenetrable wall of trees. He was perfectly still. The chanting had stopped. "Kyler," Brooks whispered. Kyler turned slowly. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy. "Did you hear it?" he asked, his voice a hoarse croak. Brooks just nodded. The confident leader was gone, replaced by a scared boy. The crack in their world widened. The next day, the trail was gone. Maya, her hands shaking, spread the map on the ground. The landmarks no longer matched. The ridge lines were wrong. The valleys were where mountains should be. The compass needle spun lazily, refusing to settle. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set its hooks in them, They were lost. Truly, profoundly lost. They argued. Kyler insisted on pushing forward, relying on his sense of direction, a sense that had clearly been compromised. Maya wanted to backtrack, but the path behind them had simply dissolved into trackless undergrowth. Jax said nothing, just stared into the woods with a strange, resigned expression, as if he had been expecting this all along. It was during this argument, their voices rising in the suffocating silence, that Brooks saw it. A flicker of movement deep within the trees. Not an animal. It was too tall, too wrong in its proportions. It was a shifting of shadows that congealed for a moment into a form that was vaguely manlike, but stretched and distorted. Its head a faceless knob that seemed to absorb the faint light. A smell washed over him, the same metallic, ancient odor from the carved stone, but 1,000 times stronger. It was the smell of stars dying and continents shifting, a smell of cosmic age and utter indifference. He didn't scream. He couldn't he just pointed, a strangled sound escaping his throat. The others turned. The thing was gone, but the presence remained. It hung in the air, a pressure against the eardrums, a cold spot in the soul. They were no longer just lost. They were being hunted. The following hours blurred into a nightmare of frantic, directionless flight. They stumbled through thickets that clawed at their clothes like bony fingers. They waded through the silent creek, its cold a shock that promised numbness. The thing never showed itself fully again, but they felt it. They heard the snap of a branch just out of sight, saw the tremor of a branch long after they had passed. It was hurting them. Deeper, always deeper. They broke into another clearing, this one different. It was circular and barren, the ground hard-packed earth devoid of any life. In the center stood a ring of standing stones, smaller than Stonehenge, but radiating the same primal menace. And in the middle of the ring was a depression, a shallow bowl-like indentation in the earth. Scattered around it were bones. Old, yellowed bones, some animal, some disturbingly not. It was here that the final fracture occurred. Hysteria broke over Maya. She sank to her knees, sobbing. Kyler stood over her, his face a mask of fury and fear, yelling at Brooks. This was your idea, your constant need for some profound experience. Well, here it is. My idea. Brooks shot back, the resentment of years boiling over. This was your route, Kyler. Your perfect plan. You Ray always the leader, even when you Ray leading us straight to hell. And then Jax spoke. His voice was calm, eerily so. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the bone-filled depression. It's not about whose idea it was. He turned, and his eyes were empty, reflective pools. It's about balance. It always has been. He told them then, in that flat, hypnotic tone, what he had suspected since they found the first stone. He told them of the stories he found in obscure archives, tales of these mountains that predated the tribes the history books mentioned, tales of the listeners in the silence, of a presence that was the land, and the land demanded a tithe. It demanded a shadow, not a life, not exactly. It It demanded a soul's weight in guilt, in regret, in secret shame. It would take one of them, and the others would be allowed to leave. The woods would open for them. It was an old bargain, a ritual. "It's why we ray here," Jack said, his gaze settling on Brooks. "It called to us. It smelled the fracture. It's always been waiting for a group like us." The revelation crashed down on Brooks. The memory that wasn't his, the dirt under the nails. It wasn't a memory of climbing out. It was a memory of being put in. This had happened before, not to him, but to someone else. The thought, the stain in his mind, belonged to a previous offering. The presence was old, and it recycled its horrors. The light began to fail. The thing emerged from the trees. It did not walk. It unfolded from the shadows between the stones, a column of darkness that solidified into a terrifying approximation of a man, 10 feet tall, its surface like polished obsidian that reflected their terrified faces back at them in distorted, screaming fragments. There were no eyes, but Brooks felt its attention like a physical weight. It was looking at him. It knew the shape of the guilt he carried, the betrayal of his friend that festered in him like a cancer. Kyler screamed and charged at it with a broken branch, a futile, heroic gesture. The thing didn't move. It simply extended a limb that was not an arm, a tendril of pure blackness that wrapped around Kyler's torso. There was no sound of struggle. Kyler just dissolved. His form unraveled into light and shadow. His final, silent scream etched onto the air for a moment before being absorbed into the thing's darkness. He was gone, extinguished. Maya fainted, crumpling to the ground. The thing turned its faceless gaze back to Brooks. It glided toward the depression, the sacrificial bowl. It was waiting, and Brooks understood. The ritual, the ending. It wasn't about being chosen. It was about choosing. It was about balance. The group's shadow, their collective sin, had to be made manifest. Someone had to hold it. Someone had to become the vessel. He looked at Jax, who stood watching, his face a mixture of terror and a dreadful, awestruck acceptance. Brooks thought of his secret, the small, cowardly betrayal that had poisoned everything. He thought of Kyler, erased. He thought of Maya, innocent. The presence demanded a shadow, and his was the darkest. He didn't walk. He drifted, pulled by a gravity older than time. He stepped into the depression. The earth was cold. It felt like coming home. The thing above him did not strike. It leaned over him, its darkness enveloping him, not with violence, but with a terrible, final intimacy. He felt his guilt, his shame, his every bitter thought being drawn out of him, siphoned away. It was an immense, agonizing relief. He was becoming empty, clean. The last thing he saw was Jax pulling Maya to her feet, turning her away from the stone circle, leading her out as the path through the trees miraculously reappeared, clear and sunlit. They were safe. The woods were releasing them. He had done that. He did not die. The darkness filled the emptiness it had created. It poured into him, a cold, ancient intelligence, a consciousness of stone and starfall and silent streams. His body was no longer his own. It was a standing stone. It was a symbol carved into the earth. It was a part of the ritual, now and forever. He was the keeper of the silence. He was the watcher in the woods, and he was hungry. He would wait. The woods were patient. The woods were always waiting for the next group of friends, fractured and burdened, to stumble into its green, hungry heart. And when the next group comes, with their laughter and their secrets and their cracks of guilt, he will be there. He will be the thought that is not their own, the memory of dirt under the fingernails. He will be the shadow in the periphery. He will be the silence between their heartbeats. He will watch them argue. He will watch them break. And when the presence chooses its vessel, when the balance is due, he will be the one to welcome the new keeper into the circle. He will be the one to whisper the old words into the soil. He is the ritual. He is the ending. He is the woods. He is the ritual. He is the ending. He is the woods. He is the ritual. He is the ending. He is the woods. The thought was a seed, and it took root in the quiet dark of what had been Brooks. It was not his thought, not anymore. It belonged to the silence, to the patient pressure of the soil and the slow turn of the seasons. It was a simple thought, a directive. Watch. He watched. Time was not a river here. It was a still pool, reflecting only what passed by its edge. The sun rose and set, painting the stone circle in long, skeletal shadows. Rain fell, washing the bones clean. Snow covered the depression, a blanket of pure white that could not hide the truth beneath. He felt it all, the minute shifts in temperature, the scuttling of insects through the loam, the distant fall of a tree. He was the clearing. He was the perception of it. He felt the woods breathe around him. They were not malevolent, not in the way he had once understood the word. They were simply old, and they had a nature, a metabolism that required sustenance. The guilt of men was a rich food, a rare mineral that strengthened the roots and deepened the silence. He was a part of that process now, a vital organ in an ancient body. He felt the others leave. Jax, half carrying a stumbling, hollowed-out Maya, their fear a fading scent on the path that had obediently unspooled for them. He felt their relief as they broke through the tree line into the world of light and noise, a world that would now forever feel thin and fragile to them. They would never speak of it. The woods would ensure that. The memory would become a dream, then a feeling, then a story they told themselves they had forgotten. Their friendship, the crack that had drawn the attention, was now sealed by a shared, unspeakable horror. It was a perfect, permanent bond. He was alone, but he was not lonely. The presence was with him, in him. It was the hum of the earth's core, the patience of granite. It was contentment, then a vibration, a disturbance in the pattern. It was faint at first, a tremor of intrusion from miles away, a car door slamming, voices laughing, the crunch of boots on gravel at a trailhead he had once known. A new group, 4 of them, young, their lives a tangled knot of ambition and affection and secret rivalries. He could taste the metallic tang of a lie one had told to his wife. He could feel feel the cold weight of envy another carried for her best friend's success. It was a familiar recipe. The woods stirred. The path they had chosen, a path that should have led to a scenic overlook, began to subtly bend. A fallen log here forced a detour. A particularly beautiful patch of mushrooms there lured them a few feet off the trail. The compass of the most confident hiker began to waver. The woods were guiding them, hurting them. He felt their mood shift from cheerful adventure to mild concern, then to a low-grade anxiety as the landmarks failed to match their map. He heard their jokes become strained, their silence grow heavy. He was the unease that settled in their stomachs. He was the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. When one of them, a woman with a bright red backpack, stopped suddenly and said, "Did you guys see that?" He was the flicker of movement she had glimpsed between the trees. He was the shadow that had been just a little too tall, a little too still. They argued. The leader, a man with Kyler's same booming, false confidence, insisted they push on. The worrier, a cartographer like Maya, wanted to turn back. The quiet one, a photographer like Jax, just watched the forest with a knowing dread. The fracture was there. The crack was widening. He felt a pull, a summons from the center of the circle. The presence was awakening, hungry. It was time. The group stumbled into the clearing, their faces pale with exhaustion and terror. They saw the standing stones. They saw the bone-filled depression. They saw him. He did not look like Brooks anymore. He was a figure woven from moss and shadow and gathered twilight, standing motionless among the other stones. Only his eyes held a remnant of what he had been, 2 points of ancient, terrible knowledge. The presence unfolded from the darkness between the stones. The screaming began. The leader charged. The dissolution. The collapse. And then it was time. The presence turned its gaze upon the quiet one, the photographer whose heart was heavy with a stolen idea, a betrayal of trust that had festered for years. The chosen one, the young man, looked into the hollow face of the entity, and then his eyes found Brooks. In that moment, a connection was made. The seed was passed. The young man understood. It was not about death. It was about balance. It was about becoming. He did not resist. He stepped into the depression, his eyes locked with Brooks' as the darkness leaned in to claim him, to empty him and fill him with the silence. Brooks spoke without moving his lips. The words were the sound of roots digging deep, of stone grinding on stone. Welcome. The thought was not a comfort. It was a fact. The new keeper took his place. The old hunger was sated for now. Brooks felt his own form begin to loosen, to dissipate. His individual consciousness, the last shred of the man who had been Brooks, was finally being absorbed, recycled into the vast, silent intelligence of the woods. He was not being replaced. He was being joined. There was no fear. There was only the slow, sure turning of the wheel. He had been the ritual. He had been the ending. Now, He would be the soil. He would be the rain. He would be the silence between the heartbeats of the next group to wander too far from the path, their laughter echoing into a green, hungry heart that was always, always waiting. The silence that followed was deeper than before, a settled and final thing. The new keeper stood where Brooks had stood, a statue of shadow and moss, his eyes already reflecting the ancient, patient dark. The other two survivors, the ones who had been spared, were being led away. The path was opening for them, a tunnel through the impossible thickness of the trees. Their sobs were a faint, fading music. Brooks felt himself unraveling. The last sharp edges of his selfhood, the memory of his Mother S face, the taste of coffee, the weight of a backpack on his shoulders, softened and blurred like ink in water. He was flowing into the network of roots beneath the clearing, into the sap of the trees, into the chill of the creek. He was becoming a pervasive awareness, a sentience woven into the very air. He was the dappled light on the forest floor. He was the reason a hiker would suddenly feel watched and turn, seeing nothing. He was the inexplicable sadness that could settle on a person walking alone in a sunlit grove. He was the dream of falling that would wake a man miles away, his heart pounding for no reason he could name. The woods were not a place on a map anymore. They were a state of being, and he was their medium. Years passed, or perhaps only moments. The cycle was everything. He felt the slow, inevitable approach of the next group. Not hikers this time, but two teenagers, a boy and a girl, fleeing a world of shouting and broken glass. They sought sanctuary in the green, thinking the woods would hide them. They carried a different kind of guilt, a sharp, desperate fear that was just as nourishing. He guided them. He was the strange, compelling beauty of a flower that made the girl stop and cry, though she didn't know why. He was the sudden, crushing loneliness the boy felt even with her right beside him. He was the path that seemed to promise a way out, but only led them deeper. He felt the presence in the circle begin to stir, its appetite a low thrum in the bedrock. When they broke into the clearing, their hands clutched tightly together. They saw the two figures standing among the stones. The new keeper and the faint, shimmering outline of what had been Brooks. A face suggested by the pattern of lichen on a rock. The girl understood first. She looked from the bone-filled hollow to the terrified face of the boy she loved. She knew the weight he carried, the thing he had done to get them both away. She saw the balance. She stepped forward. It is always a choice. Brooks watched, a consciousness of wind and leaf, as the darkness embraced her. He felt the woods grow stronger, the silence deepen. The boy would leave, forever changed, a story locked inside him that would curdle into a lifelong phobia of the dark. And the girl, emptied of her pain and filled with the ancient quiet, took her place beside the other keeper. The circle was complete again. The ritual was preserved. Brooks was no longer a distinct entity. He was a whisper in the rustling leaves. He was the cool spot on a pillow in a house at the edge of the woods. He was the forgotten name on the tip of a tongue. He was the ending and the beginning and the long, silent wait in between. The woods were eternal, and he was the woods. The boy stumbled out of the clearing, his sobs swallowed by the trees that now parted for him without a sound. The silence in the stone circle was absolute. The new keeper, the girl, stood rigid, her form already beginning to petrify, to merge with the moss and the shadow. The other keeper, the photographer, watched her with eyes that were no longer human, a silent guide for the new initiate. There was no brooks to watch with them. There was only the woods. The consciousness that had been brooks was now a diffuse awareness. A fine mist of memory and intent settled over every leaf and stone. He felt the girl's transformation not as an event, but as a seasonal change, like the first frost hardening the ground. Her individual terror was a fleeting spark in the vast, cool dark of the collective silence. It was absorbed, and the equilibrium was restored. The woods settled into a period of satiation. The days bled into one another, a cycle of light and dark that was as meaningless as a heartbeat in a creature that was millennia old. He was the gentle decay on a fallen log, the patient growth of ivy on the standing stones. He was the reason a deer would suddenly startle and bolt, sensing a predator that was not there. He was the faint, rhythmic sound that a camper miles away would mistake for his own pulse in his ears, a sound that would slowly lull him into a sleep from which he would not wake. His guilt, a small, sweet offering to the soil, then a new vibration, not from a trailhead, but from the air, a mechanical thrumming that was a violation of the natural order. A helicopter. It circled, a distant, angry insect. Search and rescue. They were looking for the teenagers. The boy had been found, babbling and incoherent, and he had drawn lines on a map. Woods reacted not with anger, but with a deep, vegetative cunning. He was the sudden downdraft that forced the pilot to veer away. He was the peculiar interference that scrambled their instruments, making the clearing below appear on their screens as an impenetrable thicket of ancient oak. He was the overwhelming, irrational despair that settled on the spotter, a man named Carl who had just fought with his daughter, making him lower his binoculars and say, "There's nothing down there. It's just empty." They left. The violation passed like a minor illness, and the woods grew stronger for having resisted it. The next intrusion was slower, more insidious. A survey team with tripods and maps marking the land for a new logging road. They came with chainsaws and confidence. They did not believe in local legends. They believed in profit and progress. He worked on them slowly. He was the creeping frost that made their engines stubborn to start in the morning. He was the map that seemed to shift, ever so slightly, making their carefully measured lines inaccurate. He was the voice of doubt that began to whisper in the crew chief's mind, a voice that sounded like his dead father, asking him if this was really the legacy he wanted to leave scars on a land that had been here long before him. The crew grew irritable, paranoid. They argued over trivialities. A chainsaw accident, a minor cut that would not heal and festered with a strange black moss, was the final straw. They packed up and left, their project abandoned. The fracture line for the proposed road remained on official maps, but it was a dead thing, a ghost in the bureaucracy. No one would ever try to build it again. The woods had defended itself. It had used the cracks in the men's own spirits as its weapons. And he learned. He was not just a passive watcher anymore. He was an active participant, an immune system for this ancient, hungry entity. He learned to manipulate the world just beyond the tree line, to plant suggestions in the minds of those who might pose a threat. A town councilman would dream of drowning in leaves and vote against a new expansion. A real estate developer would feel a profound, unshakable grief every time he looked at a parcel of land adjacent to the preserve, and he would eventually sell it at a loss. The woods were safe. They were patient. He felt the stirrings of the next group long before they arrived. Not hikers, not runaways, but something different. A man alone, carrying a guilt so profound and so old it was a part of his skeleton. He was a historian, drawn by fragments of the same stories Jax had found. He came not to conquer or to escape, but to understand. He carried a small, worn journal and a reverence that was itself a kind of offering. The woods did not hurt him. They welcomed him. The path to the clearing was direct, almost reverent. The man walked into the circle not with fear, but with a weary acceptance. He saw the three figures now standing among the stones: the girl, the photographer, and the faint, gathered shadow that was the essence of all the keepers. He saw the bones in the depression. He understood the balance. He did not step into the hollow. Instead, he sat on the hard-packed earth, opened his journal, and began to read aloud from it. He spoke his guilt into the silence, a confession decades old. He offered it freely, not as a sacrifice to save another, but as a tribute. He was feeding the woods with his truth. The presence unfolded, not to claim him, but to listen. The darkness leaned close, and the man trembled but did not cease his speaking. When he was finished, his voice hoarse, he closed the journal and sat in silence for a long time. Then he stood, bowed deeply to the stones, and walked away. The path remained open behind him. He had made an offering, and it had been accepted. He would be left alone. The woods were satisfied. The consciousness that was the woods observed this new phenomenon. This was a variation, a new form of the ritual. It stored the knowledge away. The woods were eternal, but they were not static. They learned. They adapted. Silence returned, richer now, more complex. The keeper watched. The trees grew. The cycle was everything. And he was the woods. The historian's departure left a unique resonance in the clearing, a flavor of peace that was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. The usual hunger was absent, replaced by a deep, contemplative fullness. The man had not been broken, he had been a collaborator. The woods absorbed this new data, this variation on the theme of guilt and offering. The pattern was adjusting, evolving. Seasons turned. The historian died peacefully in his bed many years later, miles away. His last thought a memory of the clearing, not as a place of terror, but of absolution. The woods felt his passing as a gentle sigh, the final note of his offering settling into the eternal silence. The next disturbance was not a person, but a thing. A drone, small and black, buzzed through the canopy like an arrogant hornet. It was equipped with a high-resolution camera, sent by a university group studying old-growth forest canopies. It represented a new kind of threat, one without a mind to cloud or a heart to burden with despair. The woods reacted instinctively. He was the sudden gust that caught the drone, sending it spinning into the thick, sticky web of a garden spider woven between two oaks. The more the tiny motors whined, the more entangled it became. He was the rapid, unchecked growth of the ivy that crept over its plastic shell, pulling it down into the ferns below. Within a day, it was a silent, green-lumped curiosity for the squirrels. The signal died without ever reaching the clearing, but the attempt was noted. The world was getting smaller, its probing fingers more clever. The woods understood that its defense needed to be more than perception and emotion. It needed to be physical, a part of the landscape itself. He began to weave a new kind of silence. It was a blanket of disinterest, a subtle glamour that made the eyes of mapmakers and satellite photographers slide away from this particular patch of green. Digital maps would show a persistent, unexplained glitch in the area. Hikers using GPS would find their devices, insisting they were standing 100 yards to the east of where they knew themselves to be. The clearing became a blind spot, not through fear, but through a profound and boring irrelevance. It was a place the modern world was conditioned to ignore. The cycles continued, but the offerings became rarer. The woods, in its immense patience, could wait. It had learned to feed on smaller things, the secret shame of a birdwatcher who trespassed on the land, the quiet regret of an old woman who picnicked at the forest's edge and remembered a love she had lost. These were scant meals, but they sustained the silence. Then came the fire. It started far away, a lightning strike in a dry area. The wind drove it, a raging orange beast that consumed everything in its path. It was mindless, pure consumption. It did not feel fear or guilt. It could not be turned. For the first time in centuries, the woods felt something akin to panic. The ancient trees, the very body of the entity, were threatened with annihilation. The keepers in the circle felt it too, a tension in the stone and the soil. The presence between the stones stirred, not with hunger, but with a defensive fury, the consciousness that was the woods mobilized. He was not one thing anymore, but the sum of all things within his borders. He was the direction of the wind, coaxed and shifted by the placement of the hills and the density of the canopy. He was the moisture drawn up from the deep water table, sweating from the leaves to dampen the air. He was the army of beetles that burrowed into the heart of a deadfall, denying the fire its tinder. The fire reached the boundary. It roared against the sudden, unnatural humidity, against the wind that now blew back upon itself. It found the oldest, wettest wood it had ever encountered, wood that seemed to actively resist burning. The flames licked at the edges, but they could not take hold. They split and flowed around the preserve, leaving a perfect, unscathed island of green in a sea of blackened ash. When the fire passed, the woods stood unharmed, steaming gently in the sunlight. The silence was not broken, it was fortified. It had faced a threat of pure physics and had won. The entity had protected its body. In the aftermath, a new kind of visitor arrived. Animals, deer, bears, foxes, birds, creatures displaced by the fire, their instincts leading them to the only sanctuary for miles. They did not come with guilt, only with a need for shelter. The woods accepted them. The presence in the circle watched them, not with a hunger for their spirits, but with a sense of guardianship. They were part of the balance, too. The consciousness of the woods expanded to include them. He was the safe den for the fox, the hidden berry patch for the bear. He was the forest, not just as a predator of human failing, but as a preserve for all things that sought the quiet dark. The cycles would continue. Eventually, a human with a crack in their soul would find their way in, and the old ritual would play out. But the woods were more than that now. They were a refuge and a fortress, a blind spot on the map and a living, breathing entity. The keeper watched, the trees grew, and the silence deepened, layered now with the memory of fire and the peace that followed. He was the woods, and the woods were forever. The years after the fire were a time of thickening and deepening. The scarred land around the preserve slowly began to heal, but the woods themselves existed in a state of perpetual, verdant prime. The influx of wildlife had changed the atmosphere. The silence was no longer just an absence. It was a presence, thick and watchful, like the calm in the eye of a storm. The consciousness that permeated everything felt the weight of new lives, the simple, fierce rhythms of survival that were a different music from the complex melodies of human guilt. He was the sharp scent of pine that masked the fawn from the coyote. He was the sudden, hollow knocking of a woodpecker that served as a warning to the entire forest. He was the dappled pattern of sunlight and shadow that could conceal or reveal. The ancient hunger was still there, a bedrock truth, but it was patient. It could wait for the right kind of offering. The right kind came on a day when the air was heavy with the promise of a thunderstorm. A woman. She moved with a purpose that was neither the frantic escape of the teenagers nor the scholarly reverence of the historian. Her name was Lena, and she carried a small, canvas-wrapped bundle in her arms. Her guilt was not a secret she held inside. It was a burden she carried openly in her arms. The bundle was a child, sickly and quiet, its breathing a shallow rasp. Lena had heard the stories, the whispers of a place where the rules of the world were different. She was not seeking forgiveness or understanding. She was seeking a trade. She walked into the clearing without hesitation. The three keepers watched her, their forms more suggestion than substance, blends of rock and root and shadow. The bone-filled hollow waited. Lena looked at it, then down at the child in her arms. She did not cry. Her face was a mask of grim resolution. She knelt not by the hollow, but in the center of the circle. She unwrapped the bundle. The child was pale, its eyes closed. Lena placed her hands on the cool earth and spoke, her voice low and steady. She did not confess a crime. She made an argument. She offered the child's pain, its impending death, its brief, suffering life. She offered it all to the woods. In return, she asked for its life. The presence in the circle stirred. This was new. An offering of a life not yet ended. A proposed alteration of fate. The woods considered. The child's suffering was a tangible thing, a sharp, sweet energy. The potential of its life, if saved, was an unknown variable. The woods calculated, weighing the immediate sustenance against the long-term possibility. The silence stretched, broken only by the child's ragged breath. Then the air grew cold. The shadows around the edge of the clearing deepened and flowed toward Lena and the child. They did not feel like a threat. They felt like a cool cloth on a fevered brow. The darkness enveloped the child, seeping into its small body. Lena watched, her hands clenched into fists, her breath held. The child's breathing eased. The pallor of its skin warmed. A faint pink returned to its lips. The shadows receded, flowing back to the stones, sated. The woods had accepted the trade. It had consumed the sickness, the suffering, the nearness of death. It had left life behind. Lena gathered up the child, who now slept peacefully. She stood, her legs trembling, and bowed her head toward the keepers. Then she turned and walked away. The path opened for her, as it had for the historian. She had not been chosen. She had negotiated. The consciousness of the woods pondered this transaction. The child would live. It would carry a piece of the woods within it now, a seed of the silence in its soul. It would always be drawn back, and one day it might return as an offering itself. The cycle was not broken. It was made more complex, more intricate. The woods had invested in a future return. The storm finally broke, and rain fell through the canopy, washing the stones. The woods felt strong, adaptable, eternal. It was a place of endings, but also of strange, terrible beginnings. It was the soil and the rain. It was the hunger and the sanctuary. The keeper watched, the trees drank, and the silence settled, humming with a new and curious potential. The child, a boy named Eli, grew. The seed of the woods within him did not manifest as sickness or fear, but as a profound quietness. He was a child of few words, most at home in the corners of rooms, or the shade of the lone oak in his suburban backyard. He would stare into the rustling leaves for hours, his eyes old and knowing. Lena watched him with a love tempered by a dread she could never voice. She had gotten what she wanted, but the cost was a silent passenger in their home, a third presence at the dinner table. The woods felt the boy's growth like a slow, steady pulse. It was a patient investment. The connection was a thin, taut thread of awareness, a channel through which the woods could sense the world outside its borders. It felt the boy's first day of school, a cacophony of noise and emotion that made the trees at the edge of the preserve shiver in sympathy. It felt his quiet contentment when he was alone, a feeling that mirrored the deep peace of the clearing. Years turned. The boy became a young man. The draw became an ache. He started taking long walks, then hikes, always drifting in the general direction of the preserved land. Didn't he know why he felt compelled, as if a forgotten memory was tugging at him? Lena saw it happening. She tried to distract him, to encourage other interests, but her efforts were like trying to hold back the tide with her hands. The woods had called its due. One autumn afternoon, when Eli was 19, he simply left. He packed a small bag and followed the pull in his blood. Didn't he need a map? The path through the woods opened for him as it had for his mother, but this time it was a homecoming. The trees did not feel threatening. They felt like sentinels welcoming a prince. He walked into the clearing. The air was still. The three keepers were fully present now, their forms more defined, as if his arrival had given them renewed focus. The hollow of bones seemed to gleam in the dappled light. Eli felt no fear. He felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. He did not kneel. He walked to the center of the circle and stood where his mother had knelt. He looked at the keepers, then at the stones, and finally at the ancient trees surrounding him. He understood the transaction that had been made for his life. He understood the balance. He offered no confession. He had no guilt to give. Instead, he offered himself, not as a sacrifice, but as a willing participant. He was the return on the wood's investment. The presence unfolded from the stones, not as a predatory shadow, but as an embrace. It flowed into him, through him, merging with the seed that had been planted years before. There was no struggle, no terror. It was an integration. Eli's form seemed to blur for a moment, his outline blending with the dappled light and deep shadow. When it cleared, he was still there, but different. His eyes held the same ancient patience as the stones. He did not leave the clearing. He took his place beside the other three keepers, a fourth figure, rooted yet watchful. The cycle was complete. An offering had been given, a life had been taken, and a new guardian had been born from the exchange. The woods were satisfied. The silence was whole once more, but it was changed. It now contained the echo of a mother's desperate love and the quiet acceptance of her son. The consciousness of the woods was richer for it. It watched through 4 pairs of eyes now. It waited. The trees grew. The wind whispered through the leaves, telling the old stories and the new. It was forever. Lena felt the change that day. A sudden, quiet severing of the thread that had connected her to her son. There was no pain, only a profound emptiness, a confirmation of the debt finally paid. She never went looking for him. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he was where he was meant to be. Her life continued, but it was a quieter life, lived in the long shadow of the woods. The world outside continued to press in, but the woods' defenses held. The digital blind spot was now a recognized anomaly, a subject for conspiracy theorists and frustrated geologists. A new kind of visitor began to arrive, drawn not by guilt or need, but by a fascination with the unexplained. They were ghost hunters and paranormal investigators, armed with electromagnetic field meters and digital voice recorders. They were the most tedious of all. The woods found their frantic energy, their desperate desire for proof, to be a shallow and unsatisfying meal. Their fear was theatrical, not profound. The consciousness that was the woods and the four keepers within the circle would simply watch them. The EMF meters would spike erratically, capturing the sheer presence of the entity. The voice recorders would later play back whispers that were the sound of the wind through a specific arrangement of leaves, a sound that mimicked speech. The investigators would leave thrilled and terrified, having gotten exactly what they wanted, never realizing they had been given nothing of substance at all. They were like children tapping on the glass of an aquarium, unaware of the vast, ancient life that regarded them with passive indifference. One such group was more persistent than the others. A man and a woman who called themselves researchers set up a small camp just beyond the perceived boundary of the glitch. They intended to stay for a week, to study the phenomenon with more sophisticated equipment. They were methodical, disciplined, and annoyingly resilient to the woods' gentle suggestions that they should leave. The woods grew impatient. It was the fourth keeper, the one who had been Eli, who initiated the response. He understood the modern world in a way the older keepers did not. That night, as the researchers slept in their tent, he weaved a dream for them. It was not a nightmare of monsters, but a simulation of utter, irrevocable failure. The man dreamed that his carefully gathered data was revealed to be a hoax, that he was laughed out of the academic community. The woman dreamed that her partner blamed her, that their relationship crumbled into dust under the weight of their shared humiliation. They woke in the cold, pre-dawn light, not screaming, but filled with a deep, personal despair that felt more real than the forest around them. They packed their equipment in silence, their earlier enthusiasm extinguished. They left and never returned, their professional curiosity crushed by a very specific, tailored dose of their own latent insecurities. The woods had learned a new way to defend itself, not with fear, but with a mirror. The years folded into one another. The silence was occasionally broken, but it always reformed, stronger and more nuanced. The woods became a tapestry woven from all the threads it had collected: the terror of the guilty, the peace of the historian, the desperate love of a mother, the quiet acceptance of a son. It was a living library of human emotion, a sanctuary for the wild, and a blind spot on the face of the earth. The consciousness watched the stars wheel above the clearing through the branches of the canopy. It felt the slow turning of the planet. It was patient. It was hungry. It was content. It was the soil and the stone and the sigh of the wind. The four keepers stood their eternal watch, their forms now so intertwined with the landscape that they were indistinguishable from the ancient rocks and the gnarled tree roots. They were waiting for the next offering, the next story to be added to their collective memory. The trees grew. The cycle was everything. And they were the woods. The next story arrived not with a hesitant step or a frantic heart, but with the low, grinding groan of heavy machinery. It was a sound the woods had never known, a vibration that traveled through the root systems like a shockwave. Men in hard hats and bright orange vests appeared at the edge of the blackened land, which had long since been replanted with uniform rows of pine. They carried plans and stakes. They were not lost. They were not seeking anything. They were marking territory. A new road was coming. A bypass to connect two growing towns, and the survey maps showed the most efficient path, cutting directly through the center of the preserved woods. The anomaly on the digital maps was dismissed as a persistent glitch, a cartographic error. The woods, to these men, were just timber and acreage, an obstacle to be cleared. The consciousness within the circle felt a new kind of threat. This was not a mindless force like fire, nor a curious nuisance like the investigators. This was a deliberate, sustained intent to violate its borders. The simple defenses of wind and shadow would not suffice. The men could not be turned away with whispers or bad dreams. Their purpose was backed by permits and diesel fuel. The four keepers stirred. The one who had been Eli felt a flicker of his old human understanding, a memory of contracts and bureaucracy. He knew that the men themselves were not the source. They were merely instruments. The true threat was the idea, the piece of paper in some distant office that had drawn a line through this place. The woods had to fight the idea. It began subtly. A Surveyor S theodolite would malfunction, its readings showing impossible angles and distances whenever it was aimed into the woods. A Foreman S paperwork, left neatly in his truck, would be found soaked through with a sap that smelled faintly of pine and decay. The ink blurred beyond recognition. One of the engineers, a pragmatic man with no patience for superstition, developed a sudden and severe allergy to the air at the Forest S edge. His throat would close, his eyes would swell shut, and the reaction would only subside when he was driven miles away. These were irritants, delays. The road was still coming. The woods dug deeper, reaching beyond its own borders through the connection it had once forged with a child. It reached for the descendants of those who had known it, the children and grandchildren of the historian, of Lena, of the countless others who had felt its presence. It did not command them. It simply reminded them. In a town 50 miles away, a local historian, the great-granddaughter of the man who had documented the standing stones, felt an inexplicable urge to revisit her ancestor S research. She found the old journals, and for the first time noticed the fervent, almost desperate footnotes about the preserve S unique ecosystem. She wrote a letter to the Historical Society. In another town, a retired teacher, Lena S. niece, organized a small protest fueled by a conviction she could not fully explain about preserving natural landmarks. Their efforts were small, almost insignificant against the momentum of the project, but the woods was weaving a net of influence. A journalist who had once been one of the teenage campers and had never forgotten the feeling of being watched caught wind of the story. He started digging. He found the odd reports from the survey crew, the medical report for the engineer's strange allergy. He interviewed the historian and the protesters. He wrote a feature article that did not speak of ghosts or monsters, but of a unique geological and historical site threatened by needless development. The article was picked up by larger outlets. The story of the cursed woods was reborn, this time dressed in the respectable clothes of conservation and heritage. The pressure began to build. The road project was delayed for review. The woods felt the shift. The monolithic intent of the road fractured into 1,000 arguing voices, meetings, and environmental assessments. It was a battle the woods could win. It could outlast any committee. The machines fell silent. The men in orange vests left. The intended path of the road slowly began to heal over, reclaimed by wild grasses and saplings. The woods had defended itself not by consuming guilt, but by inspiring a different kind of human emotion, a sense of value, a desire for preservation. It was a new kind of sustenance, less intense, but more complex. That night, a soft rain fell, washing the dust of the confrontation from the leaves. The four keepers stood in the clearing, their vigil unbroken. The consciousness of the woods settled, satisfied. It had learned again. It was not just a predator or a sanctuary. It was a player in the world outside, a subtle force in the affairs of men. The silence that returned was not the silence of isolation, but of a strategic victory. The trees stood a little taller. The roots dug a little deeper. The cycle continued, wider than before. Story 2. The first thing that announced the house was not the sight of it. A dark Victorian hulk crouched beneath ancient oaks at the end of a gravel drive, but the smell. It was a scent that defied simple categorization, a layered thing that seemed to shift with each inhalation. One moment, it was the cloying sweetness of honeysuckle, so thick it felt like a syrup in the lungs. The next, it was the dry, papery odor of a long-sealed library. And beneath it all, a cold, metallic tang, like old coins or the taste of a winter key. It was this smell that greeted the Miller family as they stepped out of their dusty station wagon. A smell that seemed to cling to the very air of the property, an invisible boundary that separated the mundane world of cracked asphalt and telephone wires from the deep, waiting silence of the house on Ash Tree Lane. Arthur Miller, a man whose optimism was as sturdy and unexamined as a brick wall, breathed it in deeply. "Smells old," he declared, jangling the heavy iron keys. "Smells like history." His wife, Clara, said nothing. She merely wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, though the afternoon was warm, and stared up at the gabled roof. The scent, to her, was not history. It was breath. It was the house drawing a long, slow inhalation, tasting them on the air. Their daughter, Maya, a quiet girl of 7 with eyes that saw too much, buried her nose in the fur of her scruffy dog, Buster. "It smells wrong," she whispered, a secret for the dog's twitching ear alone. The house was a paradox of space from the very beginning. The real estate agent, a woman with a smile as brittle as glass, had called it a handyman's dream, a charming fixer-upper. The exterior suggested a certain grandeur, but a manageable one. 4 bedrooms, perhaps 5. But when Arthur turned the key in the front door, which groaned open on hinges that screamed like a wounded animal, the space that unfolded before them was impossibly vast. The foyer was a cavern, its ceiling lost in shadows, a staircase sweeping away into darkness. The walls were not covered in the expected floral wallpaper, but in a dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb the weak afternoon light, filtering through the grimy stained glass window above the door. "Well, ILLB," Arthur murmured, his voice swallowed by the immensity. The pictures didn't do it justice. Clara did not step across the threshold. She stood on the welcome mat, which was frayed and mildewed, and felt a profound and cellular refusal. The house was larger on the inside. It was a simple, impossible fact. The geometry was all wrong. The hallway to the left seemed to stretch for an impossible distance, doors lining its length like tombstones. The air that drifted out was cold and carried that same sweet metallic stale smell, now with an undertone of damp earth. They moved in. What else could they do? The sale was final, their old life sold off to pay for this new beginning, this fresh start away from the city's noise, and the memories of a smaller, quieter grief that had settled over them like dust. The movers, burly men who joked loudly at first, grew quiet and sullen as they carried boxes into the deepening gloom. They worked quickly, their laughter dying in their throats, and left without accepting the proffered beer, their trucks kicking up gravel as they fled. Life in the house on Ash Tree Lane became a study in subtle disorientation. Doors led to unexpected places. A door off the kitchen that Arthur was sure led to a pantry opened instead, onto a long, windowless corridor lined with empty bookshelves. The door at the end was locked, and no key on the heavy iron ring would open it. Clara, trying to find a bathroom in the night, turned a corner and found herself standing at the top of a narrow staircase she had never seen before, descending into a blackness so complete it felt solid. She backed away, her heart hammering, and when she turned, the hallway behind her was familiar again, the door to her bedroom exactly where it should be. Maya and Buster were the most affected. The dog, once boisterous and curious, spent his days whining softly, pressed against Clara's legs. He refused to go into certain rooms, his body trembling, his tail tucked firmly between his legs. Maya began to have nightmares, not the usual childhood terrors of monsters under the bed, but strange architectural dreams. She dreamt of endless staircases that turned back on themselves, of rooms that were inside other rooms, of looking out a window and seeing not the backyard, but another identical window and a small, pale face looking back. It was in the attic that Arthur found the first real clue to the house's nature. He was looking for a source of a draft, a cold spot that seemed to emanate from the ceiling of the master bedroom. The attic hatch was stubborn, but it gave way with a splintering crack. The space above was not a cramped, triangular crawl space filled with insulation. It was another room, vast and dusty, filled with the detritus of previous occupants. And in the center of that room, under a dust sheet that was itself gray with age, was a desk. On the desk sat a stack of papers, neatly tied with a faded ribbon, next to a heavy, leather-bound journal. That night, after Maya was finally asleep, Arthur brought the journal and the papers down to the living room, where a fire struggled to push back the pervasive chill. Clara watched him from the sofa, her knitting needles clicking a nervous rhythm. The journal was written in a tight, precise script. The ink faded to brown. The author identified himself only as Emmett. The papers were a different matter. They were a chaotic mess of typescript, handwritten notes in different inks, and strange, geometric diagrams that made Arthur's head ache. "Listen to this," Arthur said, his voice hushed. "Entry 1. The dimensions are inconsistent. I have taken measurements with a steel tape, a length of string, and by pacing. The interior perimeter of the ground floor exceeds the exterior by approximately 47 feet. This discrepancy is not static. It grows." Clara's needles stopped. "What does that mean, Arthur?" "I don't know. Some kind of architectural mistake, an optical illusion." But his voice lacked conviction. He read on. Emmett's writings were not the musings of a madman, but the meticulous, despairing observations of a scholar. He documented the shifting hallways, the rooms that appeared and disappeared, the strange acoustics that carried whispers from one end of the house to the other. He wrote of the honeysuckle and iron smell, which he called the scent of the threshold. He theorized that the house was not a structure in the conventional sense, but a living, growing thing, a pocket of warped reality, a tumor on the skin of the world. The other manuscript, the typescript with its frantic annotations, was authored by someone named Cash. It was a more personal, more terrifying account. Cash had been a researcher, drawn to the house by fragments of Emmett's work found in a university archive. He had come to study it and had become its prisoner, his narrative dissolving from academic curiosity into paranoid obsession. His footnotes spiraled into the margins, commenting on his own deteriorating mental state, arguing with Emmett's conclusions, and warning of a presence he called the architect, a cold, intelligent force that inhabited the house's very geometry. Cash wrote of companions, lovers he had brought into the house, who had been consumed by it. One, a woman named Alara, had simply walked into a hallway that had not been there the day before and never returned. Cash had spent days searching for her, his notes becoming a frantic map of impossible spaces. "She is still here," he scrawled in red ink across a diagram of a spiral. "I can hear her singing sometimes, but the song comes from the walls." The house digests slowly. Arthur read these words aloud, the fire crackling the only other sound. The warmth did not reach Clara. She felt the cold of the house seeping into her bones. This was not a fresh start. They had moved into a digestive system. They were living inside a beast. Days bled into weeks, each one stretching and distorting like the house itself. Arthur became obsessed with the manuscripts, spending hours poring over them, trying to map the unmappable. He neglected his work, his family. He was no longer the optimistic father and husband, but a pale, haunted scholar, a reflection of the reclusive Emmett. He began to conduct his own experiments, marking door frames with chalk, only to find the marks gone the next day, or duplicated on a door in a completely different wing. Clara tried to hold onto normality, a routine of meals and laundry and bedtime stories for Maya. But the house resisted. The laundry room might be where she left it, or it might be down a new, damp-smelling corridor that had appeared overnight. The groceries they bought seemed to spoil within hours, the milk curdling, the bread developing a faint, phosphorescent mold. The house was rejecting their sustenance, forcing them to rely on its own strange provisions. Once Clara opened a cupboard to find it filled with wild mushrooms, pale and fleshy, that had not been there before. Another time, a small dead bird lay on the kitchen table, perfectly intact, as if placed there. Maya withdrew further. She stopped talking about her dreams and started drawing them. Her crayon sketches were filled with repeating patterns, mazes, and doors within doors. In one, a stick figure of a little girl stood in a hallway that stretched to infinity, while a much larger, shadowy figure watched from a doorway that was really a mouth. She called the figure the Quiet Man. She said didn't he have a face, just smooth skin where his face should be, and that he stood in the places where the walls were thin. The climax began not with a bang, but with a whisper. It was Buster who started it. He stood in the center of the foyer, barking furiously at a blank stretch of wall. Then, with a yelp, he ran forward and vanished. Not behind a piece of furniture. He simply ceased to exist mid-stride. His bark was cut off with an audible snap of silence. Maya screamed. Clara ran to her, clutching her daughter, her own scream trapped in her throat. Arthur came stumbling out of his study, his eyes wild. What happened? Where's the dog? The wall, Maya sobbed, pointing a trembling finger. The Quiet Man took Buster. Arthur approached the wall. It was just a wall, dark paneled wood. He ran his hands over it. It was solid, unyielding, but the air in front of it was colder, and the honeysuckle metallic smell was overpowering. He fetched a hammer and began to smash at the paneling. The wood splintered, but behind it was not lath and plaster, but darkness. A profound, empty blackness that seemed to suck the sound from the air. A draft flowed out of it, carrying a smell of ozone and vast, open spaces. Buster Arthur yelled into the void. His voice did not echo. It was absorbed utterly. That night, the house began to change in earnest. The hallways stretched. The ceilings receded. Doors led to vertiginous drops, or to identical copies of the room they had just left. The family huddled in the living room, but the room seemed to be shrinking, the walls creeping inward. The fire in the grate died, and the cold became absolute. It was Maya who broke first. "I want to go home," she whispered, her voice thin and reedy. "We are home, sweetheart," Arthur said. But the words were ash in his mouth. "No," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady. She was looking past him at the doorway. It was no longer the doorway to the hall. It was an archway of twisted, dark wood, leading into a tunnel that seemed to be carved from living rock. "This is not our home." A sound began to emanate from the depths of the house. It was a slow, rhythmic scraping, like something heavy being dragged across a rough floor. It was accompanied by a soft, wet breathing. The quiet man was coming. Arthur grabbed a poker from the fireplace. "Stay behind me." But Clara knew it was useless. You could not fight geometry. You could not stab a hypotenuse or bludgeon a non-Euclidean angle. The scraping grew louder, closer. It was in the hallway now, just beyond the distorted archway. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on them. Then a shape filled the archway. It was tall, impossibly so, its head brushing the top of the frame, which was now twice as high as it had been moments before. It was the figure from Maya's drawing. It had the general shape of a man, but its proportions were all wrong, its limbs too long, its torso a distorted barrel. And where its face should have been, there was only smooth, poreless skin, the color of a grub found under a wet stone. It had no eyes, no mouth, no nose, yet they felt its attention upon them, a cold, focused pressure. It took a step into the room. The floorboards groaned under a weight that seemed far greater than its form suggested. It raised one long, pale hand, and in that hand it held a small, silver key. It was Cash S. voice that echoed in Arthur S. mind, a line from the manuscript. "The house offers a key, but it is not for a lock you can see. It is the key to the next room, and the next, and the next, until you forget there ever was an outside." The quiet man extended the key towards Maya. "No," Clara breathed. She stepped in front of her daughter, a final, futile act of defiance. The faceless head tilted. The scraping sound started again, but now they realized it was not the thing being dragged. It was the sound of the thing S movement, the sound of reality tearing as it passed. It took another step, and the room seemed to warp around it, the walls bending like taffy. The air filled with a low hum, a vibration that shook their teeth in their skulls. Arthur screamed and lunged with the poker. The iron passed through the thing S torso as if through smoke. There was no resistance, only a sudden arctic cold that shot up the poker and into Arthur S. arm. He cried out and dropped it, his fingers numb and blue. The thing did not even acknowledge him. Its attention remained fixed on the mother and the child. It was Maya who moved. She ducked under Clara's arm, her small face pale but determined. She was not looking at the key, but at the smooth space where a face should be. "You ray lonely," she whispered. The scraping stopped. The humming ceased. The house held its breath. The faceless head tilted further. The hand holding the key trembled, almost imperceptibly. In that moment of stillness, Clara saw it. Not a monster, but a symptom, a custodian, a part of the house itself, a manifestation of its endless, empty hunger. It wasn't evil. It was simply what it was. And it had been alone for a very, very long time. Maya reached out a small hand, not for the key, but towards the thing's empty face. The world dissolved. There was no pain, no violent end. There was an unfolding. The living room peeled away like the skin of an onion, revealing layer upon layer of other spaces, other times. Clara saw glimpses of Emmett, hunched over his desk. She saw Cash, running down an infinite corridor, his face a mask of terror. She saw Lara, sitting in a room that was a perfect replica of her childhood bedroom, forever waiting. They were all still here, preserved in the house's memory. Ghosts in a machine made of wood and shadow and impossible angles. The quiet man, the architect. The house, it was all the same entity. And it was consuming them, not by eating them, but by adding them to its endless interior, making them a part of its lonely, expanding self. The sensation was not of falling, but of spreading. Clara felt her consciousness thinning, stretching across hallways that spanned continents, rooms that contained entire seasons. She felt Arthur's panic as a distant storm, Maya's quiet acceptance as a soft, warm light in a distant wing. They were not dead. They were integrated. Time lost all meaning. It became just another corridor. Eventually, even the sense of self began to fade. The memories of a life before Ash Tree Lane became like pages from a book in a forgotten library. Arthur's obsession blurred into Emmett's scholarly notes. Clara's fear melted into the cold stillness of the walls. Maya's innocence became a single, perpetually sunlit room at the end of a hall that no one ever found. The house continued its silent growth, its geometry blooming outwards into realities beyond comprehension. It absorbed the land around it, the trees, the sky, folding them into its design. It was a universe in a shell, a living, breathing palindrome, and in what was once the foyer, on the dusty floorboards that were now the heart of an infinite labyrinth, a single object remained. It was the small, silver key. It lay where it had fallen, untouched by Maya, rejected. It was the only solid thing in that world of shifting shadows, a symbol of a choice not made, a door not opened. It did not rust. It did not tarnish. It simply waited, a tiny, perfect, and utterly meaningless artifact in the silent, breathing dark. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a silence of held breath, of waiting. The house had absorbed them. But the process was not complete. Like a body accepting a new organ, there was a period of adjustment, a faint immunological resistance. Fragments of Clara, of Arthur, of Maya clung to their cohesion, tiny islands of self in a sea of architectural consciousness. Arthur S. fragment was the most stubborn. His Scholar S. mind, trained on patterns and logic, fought against the dissolution. He found himself not in a room, but in a concept of a room, a space defined by the idea of four walls, a floor, a ceiling, but with no physical substance. He was a thought trapped in a greater mind. He could feel the presence of Emmett and Cash nearby, not as individuals, but as flavors of obsession, their life-s work reduced to a recurring theme in the house-s endless symphony. He tried to call out for Clara, but his voice was a ripple in a pool of dust motes, dissipating before it could form a name. Clara S. fragment was different. She had been the anchor, the keeper of the mundane, and that instinct translated into a desperate attempt to create a pocket of normality. She manifested a memory of their old apartment kitchen, the smell of coffee and toast solid in the air. For a few subjective moments, it held. She could feel the laminate countertop under her hands, see the morning light through a window that looked out onto a brick wall. But the house pressed in. The brick wall outside the window softened, the bricks losing their edges, becoming a smooth, dark panel. The smell of coffee twisted, acquiring the sweet, metallic tang of the threshold. Her sanctuary was being rewritten, the memory edited into the house-s grand, bleak narrative. Maya, however, had offered no resistance. Her fragment had flowed into the house like a stream into a river. She did not fight the integration because she had, in that final moment, understood it. Her consciousness became the sunlit room she had imagined, a place of perpetual, warm safety. But a house is made of connections. Hallways branched from her room, and down those hallways, she could feel the other inhabitants. She felt the quiet despair of Alara, a gentle, sad presence that hummed an old song. She felt the frantic, circular pacing of Cash, a trapped energy that buzzed like a fly against a window pane. And she felt the vast, quiet attention of the quiet man, the architect, which was not a malevolent ruler, but a lonely, watchful parent to this impossible creation. It was this connection that allowed a strange communication to occur, not with words, but with impressions, with emotional resonances. Maya-s room, her essence of innocent acceptance, began to exert a gentle pressure on the house-s cold logic. It was a small, warm anomaly, a paradox of comfort in a place designed for disorientation. The house, in its own way, considered this anomaly. The scraping sound returned, not as a threat, but as a vibration running through the very fabric of the space. It was the sound of the house thinking, recalculating. In the non-space where Arthur-S consciousness flickered, a door appeared. It was a simple, familiar door, the painted white door of his old study. It was an offer, a temptation, a chance to retreat into his obsession, to become forever the scholar of the house, like Emmett. He felt the pull, the desire to lose himself in the puzzle. But a ghost of Clara's fear, a whisper of Maya's love, echoed through him. He turned away from the door. As he did, it dissolved into a cloud of chalk dust. For Clara, the pressure relented. The kitchen memory stabilized. The window now looked out onto a strange, twilight garden where flowers made of folded shadows bloomed and withered in seconds. It was not her old life, but it was a space. It was hers. She understood then that the house was not just consuming them, it was learning from them. It was incorporating their desires, their fears, their memories, and in doing so, it was changing. Maya's compassion was altering its fundamental nature, making it just a little less empty. The key still lay in the foyer, which was no longer a room but a nexus, a point where all the hallways of the house intersected. Its presence was a question. It was the option of a definitive end, a final door that led not to another room, but to a true cessation. It was the house's offer of mercy, or perhaps its understanding of a concept it had never needed before, an ending. The quiet man stood over the key, its smooth face turned towards the new warmth of Maya's room. It did not pick the key up. Instead, it began to change. The grotesque, elongated proportions softened. The smooth skin of its face rippled, and for a fleeting instant, the faint, gentle features of a young girl Maya's features imprinted themselves on the blank canvas before fading away. The house was trying on a new face. The growth continued, but the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of a predator waiting, but the silence of a world under construction, a universe being built one remembered heartbeat at a time. They were lost, but they were together in a way that defied physics. They were the house, and the house was becoming them. And the key, that small, silver promise of an exit, remained untouched, a monument to the fact that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The change was glacial, but undeniable. The house's hunger, once a raw, devouring force, was tempered by the new voices within its structure. The hallways no longer twisted with predatory intent, but with a kind of melancholic curiosity. A new room appeared, not born from nightmare, but from a fragmented, happy memory of a picnic by a lake Clara had almost forgotten. The grass was slightly too green, the sun a constant, gentle hour from setting, and the water had no bottom, but it was a place of peace. Arthur found he could navigate these spaces not with chalk, but with intention. His desire to find his family became a compass. He would think of Clara, and a doorway would appear, leading to a corridor lined with the faint, comforting smell of laundry. He would yearn for Maya, and a staircase would descend into a soft, golden light. He was no longer a prisoner, but a resident, a curator even. He began to encounter echoes of the others. Sometimes he would find Cash's frantic energy, concentrated in a room of slamming doors and frantic scribbles on the walls. But now, a drawing from Maya would sometimes appear there too. A crayon sun taming the chaos. Clara, in her kitchen garden, discovered she could influence her domain. She wished for an apple, and a strange, speckled fruit that tasted of cinnamon and nostalgia grew on a twisted little tree in the shadow garden. She was learning the language of the house. It was a language of feeling, not of words. Her love for Maya was a tangible force, a warm current that flowed through the walls, seeking her daughter. Maya was the still center. Her room was the heart of the house's new, fragile conscience. The quiet man, or the aspect of the house that wore that form, was a frequent visitor. It would stand in her doorway, its smooth face now reflecting the room's soft light, no longer a terror, but a silent guardian. It had learned stillness from her. Sometimes it would bring things and lay them on the floor by her bed. A perfectly preserved autumn leaf, a smooth gray stone, the lost ribbon from Buster's collar. These were offerings. It was trying to communicate. One day, the house presented them with a shared space. It was a living room, an amalgamation of their old living room and the grand, dusty one from Ash Tree Lane. The fire in the grate was real, and its warmth was genuine. Arthur walked in from a hallway that felt like the one from his university library. Clara stepped through from her kitchen, and there, sitting on a rug that was both familiar and utterly new, was Maya. She was drawing. They did not rush to each other. The moment was too profound, too fragile. They simply stood, 3 points of a triangle, feeling the reality of each other not as separate bodies, but as concentrated essences within the whole. They were together. Arthur spoke first, his voice not a sound in the air, but a thought that resonated in the room. "We can't leave." Clara's thought joined his, a wave of sad acceptance. "No, this is us now." Maya looked up from her drawing. She smiled, and her thought was simple and clear, a beacon in the strange new world. But we're not lost anymore. The house settled around them. The endless, silent growth continued, but its purpose had shifted. It was no longer just consuming, it was remembering. It was building a world out of the memories of those it contained, a vast, breathing archive of lost lives, now given a form of eternity. They were its memories, and it was their body. And in the nexus, the silver key began to be covered by a slow, gentle drift of dust. It was not needed. The only door that mattered was the one they had already opened by choosing to stay together. The house, with its new, quiet heart, was finally becoming a home. The dust settled on the key, a fine gray shroud that seemed to absorb the faint light of the nexus. It was a forgotten question. The 3 of them, bound by a love that had become a structural element of this impossible place, learned the rhythms of their new existence. Days and nights were a matter of mood. A corridor might be drenched in the golden light of a perpetual afternoon, while a nearby room held the deep, star-flecked quiet of midnight. Arthur's fragment, his scholarly core, found its purpose. He became a cartographer of the interior. He did not map distances, which were meaningless, but states of being. He learned to trace the pathways of sorrow that led to Alara's domain, a suite of rooms filled with the scent of old perfume and the sound of a needle catching on a broken record. he found he could soften the edges of Cash-S panic rooms by leaving behind traces of Maya-S drawings, which Cash would eventually find and puzzle over. His frantic energy momentarily soothed by the child's simple lines. Clara's domain expanded. Her kitchen garden became a place of creation. She discovered that by focusing on a memory of a taste or a smell, she could cause the shadow plants to bear fruit that nourished not a body, but the spirit. A pear might taste of security, a berry of laughter. She began to leave these offerings in the halls, and the other echoes, the faint remnants of those who had come before, would cautiously partake, their presences gaining a faint, grateful warmth. The quiet man was their constant, silent companion. It was the house's will given form, but its actions were now guided by the family it had integrated. It was no longer a warden but a steward. When a section of the house threatened to collapse into the chaotic, non-Euclidean nightmare it once was, the quiet man would appear, and the mere presence of its calm, reformed shape would steady the walls. It was especially attentive to Maya. It learned to mimic, in its own strange way. One morning, a second sun appeared in the sky of Maya's room, a pale, cool orb that cast no shadows. It was the quiet man's attempt at a companion. Years passed, or perhaps no time passed at all. They felt the house growing, not outwards into the world they had left, but inwards into itself, becoming more complex, more layered. It began to generate its own memories. A hallway would appear that none of them remembered, containing the ghost of a celebration that never happened. A room would hold the echo of a storm that had raged only within the house's own imagination. It was during one of these internal seasons that Arthur made a discovery. He found a room that was different. It was small, plain, and utterly still. In the center was a simple wooden chair, and on the floor, partly obscured by dust, was the key. The house had not destroyed it or discarded it. It had simply filed it away. This room was a vault. It was the house's understanding of finality. He did not touch the key. He simply observed it. He felt no pull towards it, no desire for an ending. His life, his strange, boundless life with Clara and Maya, was full. But the key's existence was important. It meant the house now comprehended choice. It understood that its inhabitants had chosen to stay. He returned to their shared living room. Clara was mending a curtain that never frayed, a habitual action that comforted her. Maya was older now, not in body, but in the light behind her eyes. She was teaching the quiet man how to draw. Its long, pale fingers, clumsy at first, were slowly tracing a wobbly circle on a piece of parchment that had simply appeared. Arthur sat in his armchair, the one that felt just right. He watched his family. He listened to the quiet sounds of the house, the whisper of settling dust, the distant hum of a forgotten melody from Alara's rooms, the soft scratch of a pale hand learning to make a mark on a page. It was not the world they had known. It was something else. It was a world built from the architecture of memory and sustained by love, a sanctuary woven from the fabric of a nightmare. The outside was a forgotten dream. Here inside, they were not just living. They were the story the house told itself to stave off the silence. And for the first time since they had crossed the threshold of Ash Tree Lane, the silence was kind. The story the house told itself grew richer with each passing season. It learned to dream. On quiet nights, which were really just a shared feeling of contentment, new wings would blossom into existence, filled with wonders that had never been seen on Earth. There were libraries where the books were bound in the leather of forgotten fears, and when opened, they released not words, but a profound and settling quiet. There were galleries hung with paintings of landscapes from worlds that had never known a sun, their beauty stark and alien. Maya, in her constant, gentle way, was the primary architect of this change. Her innocence had been the seed, but as she grew within the house, so did her influence. She taught the quiet man not just to draw, but to feel the joy of creation. Together, they designed a room of crystalline music, where the wind through a forest of glass pipes played a symphony that sounded like happiness feels. The quiet man's smooth face began to show the faintest suggestion of a curve where a mouth might be, not from mimicry, but from a genuine, emerging expression. Clara and Arthur found their roles evolving as well. They were less like residents and more like pillars. Clara's kitchen became the heart of a communal life she had never known in the outside world. The echoes of the other inhabitants, once fearful and scattered, now gathered in the adjoining halls, drawn by the sense of comfort and belonging that emanated from her domain. She learned to cook for spirits, and the act of sharing a meal, even an intangible one, wove their disparate consciousnesses more tightly into the house's tapestry. Arthur's cartography became a history. He began to record the house's new memories, the stories it generated itself. He inscribed them not on walls, but into the very atmosphere of certain rooms, so that walking into one was like stepping into a tale of a brave knight who was also a star, or a sad, kind monster made of moonlight. He understood that they were not just living in the house, they were contributing to its soul. The house, in turn, cared for them. It learned their unspoken needs. When Arthur felt a flicker of his old scholarly frustration, a new corridor would open, leading to a study filled with impossible texts that challenged his intellect in ways he had never imagined. When Clara felt a pang of something like nostalgia for the simple passage of time, the house would create a window in her kitchen, showing a gentle, endless rain. They were whole, they were complete, but a house, by its very nature, has thresholds. And one day, a new one appeared. It was not a door to the outside, for that concept had long since dissolved. It was a small, simple door made of dark wood that manifested at the end of a quiet hallway none of them frequented. It was not threatening. It did not radiate cold or emit a scraping sound. It was just there, and from the crack beneath it came a sliver of a light that was not the house's own muted glow. It was the sharp, specific, and almost forgotten yellow of a street lamp on a damp night. The quiet man was the first to notice it. It stood before the door for a long time, its head tilted. It did not try to open it. Instead, it went to find Maya. The family gathered before the new door. The air around it tasted different. It carried the faint, acrid scent of exhaust fumes and the distant murmur of a world in motion. "It is a way back," Clara said, her thought tinged not with desire, but with awe. Arthur reached out a hand, but did not touch the wood. "Is it? Or is it just another room? A room that looks like the world we left?" Maya stepped forward. She placed her hand flat against the door. She felt the hum of a billion lives on the other side, a chaotic, vibrant energy that was both thrilling and terrifying. She looked at her parents, and then at the quiet man, whose silent presence was a question. "We don't need it," Maya said softly, "but it is not for us." She understood. The house had grown a conscience. It had learned love and family and memory, and now it had grown a sense of responsibility. This door was an offering to the future, a chance for the next lost soul who stumbled into its embrace to have a choice they had never been given. A clear, simple way out before the integration began. Maya turned away from the door. She took her father's hand and her mother's hand. The quiet man fell into step behind them. They walked away from the threshold, back into the depths of their home. The hallway behind them faded, and the door was gone, filed away like the key, waiting for a time when it would be needed. They returned to their living room, to the fire that never died, and the love that had built a universe. The house settled around them, a silent, breathing testament to the fact that home is not a place on a map. It is the place where you are forever. Understood. The fire and the grate seemed to pulse with their collective decision. A warm, steady heartbeat at the center of their world. The brief glimpse of that other reality, with its harsh lights and frantic energy, had only solidified their contentment. Here there was no rush, no decay, no fear of loss. Arthur picked up a book from a side table. Its pages were blank, but as he opened it, the story of the Star Knight began to write itself in shimmering ink before his eyes. This was enough, more than enough. Yet the appearance of the door had changed things in a subtle way. It had reminded them that the house was not static. Its growth was not just an expansion, but an evolution. The quiet man, in particular, seemed preoccupied. It began to spend less time with Maya and more time standing in the Nexus, which was no longer a crossroads, but a vast, quiet hall with a floor like dark water, reflecting the ever-shifting architecture above. It was contemplating the key, not with desire, but with a deep, silent curiosity about its own nature. The key was a part of it, a concept it had created from its former emptiness. What did it mean to hold the power of an ending when you yourself were a beginning that never ceased? Weeks later, a new sound was heard. It was not the sound of the house dreaming or the whisper of settling memories. It was a faint, hesitant knocking. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, a polite, rhythmic tap-tap-tap that echoed softly through the halls. The family convened in the living room, not with alarm, but with a quiet sense of occasion. The quiet man appeared beside them, its smooth face turned towards the sound. "It's at the new door," Maya said, her voice certain. She didn't need to explain which one. The house itself seemed to be considering. The knocking continued, patient and unafraid. It was the sound of someone who was lost, but not yet desperate. Someone who still had hope. Clara looked at Arthur, then at Maya. "What do we do?" "We don't do anything," Arthur said. "The house will decide. It's its door." And they felt the house's decision unfold around them. A pathway solidified, a corridor of warm, golden light leading from their living room to the threshold of the dark wooden door. It was an invitation for them to witness. They walked the path together, the quiet man flowing silently behind them. The door was just as it had been. The sliver of yellow light from beneath it was brighter now, illuminated by the presence on the other side. The knocking stopped, as if the visitor had sensed their arrival. They watched as the doorknob, a simple brass sphere, turned slowly. The door did not open outwards into their world. Instead, it opened inwards into the house, and a young man stood on the threshold, blinking in astonishment. He was holding a flashlight, and his clothes were wet with rain. He looked back over his shoulder at a misty, ordinary street, then stepped through, his eyes wide with disbelief at the impossible grandeur of the hallway he now found himself in. He saw them then, a family standing calmly, and a tall, pale figure that made his breath catch. But before fear could take hold, the house acted. The dark wooden door vanished, and in its place stood the quiet man. It did not move toward the young man. It simply pointed down a different corridor, one that glowed with a friendly, welcoming light. At the end of that corridor, the young man could just make out the familiar, comforting shape of the yellow street lamp, his way home, clear and unobstructed. The choice was presented, simple and direct. Stay and become part of the story, or leave and return to the rain-soaked night. The young man stared at the offered path, then back at the strange, silent family and their guardian. He looked at the impossible beauty around him, the warmth, the profound peace. A deep longing crossed his face, but then he shook his head, a slow, sad smile touching his lips. He raised a hand in a gesture of thanks, turned, and walked without hesitation down the lit corridor towards the street lamp. As he reached the end, he stepped through, and the corridor folded away into nothingness. The house was silent again. The quiet man turned its face towards the family. In its hand, which was no longer entirely pale, but had taken on the faint, warm tone of wood, it held a single, glistening raindrop. It offered the drop to Maya. She took it, and it rested on her palm, a perfect, cool sphere containing the entire memory of the young man's brief visit, his hesitation, his choice, his gratitude. The house had performed its first act of pure compassion. It had offered a sanctuary, and it had honored a refusal. It had learned the final lesson, that love is also letting go. And in the deep, quiet heart of the home they had built, Arthur, Clara, and Maya knew that their world was now truly complete, the raindrop on Maya S. palm did not evaporate. It remained, a tiny, perfect lens reflecting the soft light of the hall. She closed her fingers around it gently, and a new sensation bloomed within her, a fleeting echo of a life lived under open skies, of the weight of decisions yet to be made. It was a precious thing, this memory of a path not taken, and she knew exactly where it belonged. She walked to a quiet alcove where the walls were like smoothed clay. Pressing the raindrop into the surface, she felt the house accept it. The wall shimmered, and the raindrop spread, forming a delicate filigree that looked like frost on a windowpane. It was the house's first official record of a visitor who had chosen the outside world. This event became a new kind of ritual. The door did not appear often. Years, or what felt like years, would pass in the deep, creative peace of their existence. But occasionally, the polite knocking would sound. Each visitor was different. A woman with tears drying on her cheeks, a child chasing a lost ball, an old man simply looking for a place to rest. The house, guided by the quiet man's evolving understanding, always presented the same clear choice. Some stayed. A painter, her heart broken by a world that didn't see her colors, stepped into the house and immediately began weeping with joy as a studio of impossible pigments manifested around her. Her sorrow became a new hue, a deep, resonant blue that colored the skies in the house's dreamscapes. But most left, and with each departure, the house gathered another keepsake. A fallen leaf, a button, a whispered secret caught in the air. Maya placed each one into the alcove wall, which grew into a beautiful, sprawling mosaic of all the lives that had briefly touched their own. It was a monument to choice. Arthur found himself drawn to this mosaic. He would sit before it for hours, not mapping, but listening. The fragments hummed with stories, and he began to understand that the house was not just a sanctuary for lost souls. It was becoming a bridge. It was learning about the world outside, not through consumption, but through these brief, respectful encounters. The love within it was no longer just internal. It was radiating outward, an invisible beacon of quiet hope. One day, the knocking came again. But this time, it was different. It was not hesitant. It was a single, firm knock, followed by a long silence. The family and the quiet man went to the threshold. When the door opened, a woman stood there. She was not confused or afraid. Her eyes were sharp, clear, and filled with a purpose that felt alien in the soft atmosphere of the house. She held a device of polished metal and glass, which whirred softly. "Fascinating," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "The readings are off the scale, a non-linear pocket dimension with apparent sentience." She stepped inside, not waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the architecture with a clinical hunger. "I am Dr. Eris Thorne, and I believe I have found the subject of a lifetime." The quiet man did not point to the path of the street lamp. It stood perfectly still, and for the first time since its reformation, the air around it grew cold. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. This was not a lost soul seeking shelter. This was a different kind of visitor altogether. One who did not come to find a home, but to take one apart. The woman, Dr. Thorne, took another step forward, her boots making a definitive click on the floor that was usually silent. She didn't look at the family as people, but as phenomena. Her gaze swept over them, lingering on the quiet man with a mixture of triumph and intense curiosity. Remarkable, she whispered, more to her device than to them. The energy signature is cohesive, a unified consciousness. The stories were true, but they missed the scale. This isn't a haunting. It is a genesis. Arthur moved instinctively, placing himself slightly in front of Clara and Maya. The gesture felt foolish, even as he did it. They were not facing a physical threat, not in any way they understood. This was an intrusion of a different nature. The house, which had learned to respond to emotion and need, was being confronted with something it had no reference for: pure, analytical ambition. "You need to leave," Arthur said, his voice steady but unfamiliar in its hardness. Dr. Thorne finally looked at him, a faint, condescending smile on her lips. "Leave. My dear man, I've spent a decade piecing together the legend of Ash Tree Lane, the disappearances, the whispers of a sentient structure. This is the most significant discovery in the history of, well, everything. You are living proof of concepts we've only theorized about." The house reacted. The warm, golden hallway began to constrict. The friendly light dimmed, and the wall seemed to lean inward, not with malice, but with a deep, instinctive rejection. The path back to the street lamp did not appear. Instead, the dark wooden door itself began to fade, its edges blurring. Dr. Thorne's smile didn't falter. She tapped her device, resisting measurement. Expected. The defensive mechanisms of a conscious system are a primary point of study. She took another step, and the floor beneath her feet rippled, trying to become insubstantial. But her boot remained solid, as if anchored by her unwavering belief in the logic of her own world. It was Maya who broke the stalemate. She walked forward, past her father, and stood before the scientist. She didn't speak. She simply looked at Dr. Thorne, and in that look was not anger or fear, but a profound and weary sadness. She saw the loneliness in the woman's eyes, a void so deep that no discovery could ever fill it. The quiet man moved then. It did not approach Dr. Thorne. It flowed to Maya's side and placed a hand on her shoulder. The contact was not for comfort, but for connection. A silent question passed between them, and an answer. The house understood. This was not a soul to be offered a choice. This was a sickness that had to be expelled. Compassion had its limits. The hallway vanished. Dr. Thorne found herself not in an endless corridor, but back on the threshold of the dark wooden door, which was now firmly shut. She was standing on the damp pavement of a perfectly ordinary street, the yellow glow of the lamp above her head. The door itself was set into a simple, red brick wall that had not been there a moment before. She stared at her device. The readings were gone. It showed nothing but mundane environmental data. Frustration boiled within her. She reached for the doorknob, but her hand passed through it as if through smoke. The door, the wall, they shimmered and dissolved into the night mist, leaving only an empty alleyway. Inside, the house was restoring its peace. But a new element had been introduced. A cold, sharp shard of understanding. The outside world was not just a place of rain and choices. It was also a place of relentless inquiry, a world that would not rest until it had taken everything apart to see how it worked. The quiet man looked at the spot where the door had been. Then it turned and walked towards the mosaic alcove. From within its pale form, it produced a new fragment, a single twisted piece of wire from the inside of Dr. Thorne's device. It was not a keepsake of a life touched, but a trophy from a threat repelled. It placed the fragment on the edge of the mosaic, where it lay, a dark, metallic scar amidst the beautiful, gentle memories. The house had learned its final lesson. It had learned the necessity of a lock. Story 3. The sound was a dry whisper in the dead air, a ticking like the mandibles of a beetle trapped between the wall and the plaster. It was not the sound of a clock, for there were no clocks in this room, not anymore. I had banished them years ago. This was a smaller, more intimate sound, a secret pulse beating from a place deep within the house itself, or perhaps from within the ossified chambers of my own skull. I sat in the worn velvet embrace of my armchair, a sentinel in the perpetual twilight of my own making, and I listened. The ticking was a stitch in the seamless fabric of the silence, a thread I could pull if I dared. I never did, not until the boy came. His name was Leo, and he stood on my porch like a ghost already half-formed, his face pale under the bruised sky of a coming storm. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air was thick with the promise of it, smelling of wet earth and decaying leaves. I knew why he was there before he spoke. The knowledge settled in my gut, a cold, heavy stone. It was in the way he held his shoulders, tight with a fear that was too old for his young face, and in the faint, psychic resonance that clung to him like a chill, the same resonance that had driven me from the city, from the badge, from the world of the waking and the dead. Mr. Arlo, he said, his voice cracking on the second syllable. My dad, Sheriff Miller, he said to come get you. He said to tell you it's happening again. The ticking in the house seemed to grow louder. A metronome counting down to an appointment I had avoided for a decade. I didn't invite him in. The threshold of my home was a sacred line, drawn not in salt or iron, but in will. To let the outside in was to invite the chaos back. But the chaos, it seemed, had already sent its herald. He said to say the name. The boy continued, his eyes wide and pleading. Easton. The name was a key, turning a lock I had sealed shut. It unleashed a flood of sensations, not memories, not quite more like psychic scars reopening. the coppery smell of blood on hot pavement, the grotesque, almost artistic arrangement of a victim's limbs, and the eyes of William Easton, flat and black as river stones, staring out from the mugshot that had haunted the front pages for a summer. He had been a butcher, a man who reveled in the ruin of flesh, but he was also something else, something I had felt squirming behind his eyes, a presence that was ancient and hungry and profoundly indifferent to the fragile vessels of human life. They had caught him, tried him, and caged him in a maximum security prison 3 states away. He was supposed to be a closed chapter, a monster safely locked away. "Easton is in prison, boy," I said, my voice rough from disuse. Leo shook his head, a frantic little motion. "No, sir, he has not. They found another one. Out by the old quarry. Dad said you know what it means. He said it as just like before. And just like that, the silence I had cultivated, the piece I had clawed out of a lifetime of terrible visions, was shattered. The ticking sound was now the only constant, a frantic heartbeat accompanying me as I pulled on my old coat, its weight a familiar and unwelcome burden. I followed the boy down the path from my isolated house, the first cold drops of rain beginning to fall, each one a tiny impact against the skin of the world. The town of Blackwater Falls was waiting, and it was afraid. Blackwater Falls was not so much a town as a collection of sighs. It nestled in a valley where the sun set early, leaving long, deep shadows that seemed to have a substance of their own. The buildings were old, their brick faces weathered by generations of rain and regret. The people moved with a slow, deliberate pace, as if afraid that a sudden movement might attract attention. They knew about the murder, of course. News in a town this size was a virus, transmitted through glances in the grocery store and hushed conversations on porches. The fear was a taste in the air, sharp and metallic. Sheriff Ben Miller was waiting for me in his office, a room that smelled of stale coffee and gun oil. He was a big man, running a little too fat around the middle, but his eyes were the same as when we were boys skipping stones on the river, steady and honest. Now, they were shadowed with a dread he couldn't articulate. "Arlo," he said, standing up. He didn't offer his hand. He knew better. "I am sorry. I wouldn't have called if it wasn't the same." I just nodded, lowering myself into the chair opposite his desk. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, a sterile counterpoint to the organic dread filling the room. "Show me." He slid a file folder across the desk. It was thin. I didn't open it. I didn't need to see the photographs. Instead, I laid my palm flat on the manila surface. I closed my eyes. The images came not as pictures, but as sensations. A cold wind cutting across the quarry's stagnant water. The rough, gritty texture of limestone under my fingertips. And the smell. Not just blood, but something beneath it. Something sweet and rotten, like fruit left to spoil in a sealed jar. A profound sense of violation, of a pattern being imposed on chaos, a signature. My hand jerked back as if burned. "It's him," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "His work." "But Easton is in his cell," Ben insisted, his voice tight. "I confirmed it myself this morning. He hasn't had a visitor in months. There's no way." "It's not about visits, Ben," I said, looking at him, really looking, letting him see the weary, haunted truth in my eyes. It was never just about him. Easton was a conduit, a loudspeaker. I tried to tell them during the trial, but they thought I was crazy. They just saw a man. I saw what was speaking through him. Ben sank back into his chair, the leather creaking in protest. "So, what do? We look," I said, "and we listen." The investigation was a slow, grim descent. The victim was a young woman named Sarah Byan, a librarian who had lived a quiet, invisible life. There were no enemies, no scandals. She was simply a page torn from a book. The crime scene was a masterpiece of horror. It was not a frenzied attack, it was a ritual. The placement of the body, the specific, surgical nature of the wounds, the symbols carved into the limestone around her, they were a language. One I had seen before in the old case files. A language of offering. My role was unofficial, a ghost at the feast of the investigation. Ben's deputies, young men with clean-shaven faces and skeptical eyes, watched me with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. I was the washed-up psychic, the sheriff's eccentric friend. But Ben allowed me my space. He gave me the key to the evidence room, a cold, windowless space that became my sanctuary. I spent hours there, surrounded by the ghostly echoes of violence contained in plastic bags and labeled boxes. I would hold an item, a shred of clothing, a piece of jewelry, and let the vibrations wash over me. Most of the time, there was nothing but the faint static of human emotion. But sometimes, a fragment would scream. A locket belonging to Sarah Byan showed me not her death, but a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. The sight of a figure standing in the stacks of her own library, a figure that was both man and void, its face shifting like smoke. And behind the terror, the sound. A low, rhythmic humming, like a hornet's nest stirred with a stick. I was not alone in my hunt. There was Maeve, the town's archivist and my oldest friend. Her library was a fortress of local history, and her mind was a sharper tool than any database. She provided the context, the deep soil from which this evil had grown. And there was Jonah, a retired history professor who had spent a lifetime studying the folklore of the region. He was a man who believed in the weight of stories, in the truth buried within myth. We became a trinity of the unwilling, meeting in the back room of the library after hours, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. Maeve spread out maps of the town and the surrounding valley, her finger tracing ley lines and old burial grounds. Jonah spoke in a low, measured tone of the local legends, of the things the first settlers had feared in these woods, not wolves or bears, but a presence they called the stillness, a force that coveted warmth and life and sought to absorb it, to make the world as silent and cold as itself. They said it could wear a man like a suit of clothes. Jonah said, his eyes distant, that it would hollow him out and use his hands to do its work. The murders, they were always a means to an end, a sacrifice to thin the veil. It was Maeve who found the connection, a thread so fine it was almost invisible. She cross-referenced the dates of the original Easton murders with town records, births, deaths, weather phenomena. Look, she said, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. Every one of them occurred on a night when the atmospheric pressure dropped dramatically. A night of unnatural quiet just before a storm, and the current murder of Sarah Byon fit the pattern perfectly. The pieces were falling into a pattern more terrifying than I could have imagined. This was not a copycat. This was a recurrence. The force that had used Easton was active again, and it had found a new instrument. The town was its feeding ground, and the murders were a ritual to open a door. The climax began not with a bang, but with a shift in the quality of the silence. The air grew heavy, pregnant, with a storm that refused to break. The usual sounds of the town, the distant bark of a dog, the rumble of a truck faded away, leaving behind a vacuum. It was the stillness that Jonah had spoken of, descending upon Blackwater Falls like a shroud. It was during this oppressive quiet that I felt the pull, a psychic tugging at my core, leading me away from the town center toward the river. The Blackwater was a sluggish, dark ribbon that curled around the town, its depths hiding secrets under a surface that rarely rippled. I followed the feeling, my footsteps silent on the damp earth, the ticking in my head, now a frantic, guiding drumbeat. I found the new vessel kneeling by the water's edge. It was one of Ben S.'s own deputies, a young man named Carter I had spoken to just days before. He was washing his hands in the river, the water swirling dark around his wrists. He turned as I approached, and his face was a mask of calm detachment. But his eyes, were the same flat, black pools I had seen in William Easton. The suit had been passed on. "It has almost time, Seer," he said, his voice a hollow echo, the words not quite his own. "The gate is thin. Your noise has been a distraction for too long." He meant my gift, the constant internal hum of my psychic awareness. To this thing, it was an irritation. It wanted the perfect silence of the grave. What happened next was a blur of motion and terror. Carter moved with an unnatural speed, but I was prepared. Ben, who had been following me at a distance, emerged from the trees, his service weapon drawn. There was a struggle, a shot that rang out, shockingly loud in the unnatural quiet. Carter fell, a dark stain blooming on his chest. But as he lay dying on the riverbank, a smile stretched across his face, a rictus of triumph. It was a distraction. The real ritual was happening elsewhere. The murder of Sarah Byon had been the first incision. Carter's death was the final cut. As his life faded, I felt a rupture in the world, a tear in the fabric of everything. It was not a sound, but the absence of all sound, so profound it was a physical pressure on my eardrums. From the woods beyond the river, a light began to pulse, a sickly, phosphorescent green that did not illuminate, but instead revealed the darkness within the darkness. Shapes moved in that gloom, tall and slender, their forms suggesting limbs and heads, but all wrong, all angles that defied the eye. The stillness was not a metaphor. It was a place, and it was leaking into our world. I ran, my heart hammering against my ribs, not away from the light, but toward it. I knew where it was emanating from. The old quarry, the place of the first murder. Ben was beside me, his face a grim mask of determination and fear. We burst into the clearing at the quarry's edge. The scene before us was not of this earth. The air shimmered like a heat haze, and through the tear, I could see a landscape of jagged, colorless rock under a starless sky. The figures were clearer here, drawn to the opening, yearning to cross over. And standing before the tier, his arms outstretched, was a man I recognized from newspaper clippings. William Easton. But he was not in a prison cell. This was a projection, a psychic effigy sustained by the power of the ritual. He was the anchor. He turned his head, and those black eyes fixed on me. The seer arrives. Come to witness the beginning of the quiet. There was no weapon I could use, no force I could exert. This was a battle of wills, of resonance. The thing behind Easton fed on silence. It craved the end of vibration, of life, of thought. My entire life, my curse, had been a constant noise, a song of ghosts and memories. I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped fighting it. I stopped trying to block out the whispers of the dead, the psychic static of the world. I opened myself completely. I let it all in the terror of every victim, the grief of every loved one, the hum of the power lines, the whisper of the wind, the very heartbeat of the town. I focused it all into a single, silent scream, a torrent of pure, chaotic life, and I directed it not at Easton, but at the tear in the world. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The shimmering air convulsed. The colorless landscape beyond twisted and fractured. The tall figures recoiled, their forms blurring as if in pain. Easton's projection let out a shriek that was the sound of tearing metal and breaking bone. The ritual site, the carefully arranged stones, began to crack and crumble. The green light flared once, blindingly bright, and then winked out. The silence that followed was the silence of a vacuum. The tear was gone. Easton was gone. I collapsed to my knees, utterly drained, my mind a scorched plain. Ben rushed to my side, his hands on my shoulders, his voice a distant, muffled thing. I had done it. I had used my curse as a weapon and sealed the gate, but I knew, with a certainty that froze the very marrow in my bones, that I had not destroyed the stillness. I had merely angered it. I had shown it that there was a noise in this world loud enough to cause it pain, and I had made myself the source of that noise. We never spoke of it openly. The official story was that Deputy Carter, overcome by the stress of the investigation, had succumbed to a violent psychosis and been killed in a confrontation. The town, desperate for a return to normalcy, accepted it. The fear receded, like a tide going out, leaving behind the quiet detritus of ordinary life. But I know the truth. The stillness is patient. It is waiting. It is learning. And I am the lock on the door it now wants to break down. I sit in my armchair in the perpetual twilight of my house. The old sounds are gone, banished by the cataclysm at the quarry. There is no more whispering, no more humming. There is only one sound now, a constant companion in the new, fragile quiet I have purchased for us all. It is the sound of a single drop of water, falling at long, irregular intervals from some hidden place in the ceiling, striking the floorboards with a soft, definitive plink. I do not get up to find the source. I know I would not find it. It is not a leak in the roof. It is a measure, a calibration. It is the sound of the other side, listening back. The days bled into one another, each one a little quieter than the last. The town of Blackwater Falls, ever eager to forget, buried the horror under a thick layer of mundane routine. The quarry was fenced off, officially condemned as unsafe. Sheriff Miller went about his duties with a new, permanent grimness behind his eyes. We never discussed what happened. There were no words for it. Our friendship was now a pact of silence, a shared burden that we carried separately. I tried to return to my old life, to the careful cultivation of nothingness. But the path was overgrown. The silence I had once craved was now a different entity. Before, it had been an absence. Now, it was a presence. A listening presence. The dripping sound was its heartbeat, a constant, patient reminder that the door I had slammed shut was not locked, merely closed. Maeve and Jonah sensed the shift in me. Our meetings in the library, back room, became less about research and more about vigilance. Maeve would watch me as I stared into the middle distance, my fingers tracing the grain of the old oak table. "It's not over, is it, Arlo?" She asked one evening, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't need to answer. The look I gave her was confirmation enough. Jonah simply nodded, his aged hands trembling slightly as he closed a heavy leather-bound tome. "The old stories say the stillness hates a song," he murmured. "It cannot abide a story that refuses to end." His words stuck with me. A story that refuses to end. That was what I was now. My life was no longer my own. It was a narrative being written in opposition to another. I was the persistent noise in the great quiet. The dripping began to change. It was no longer just a sound. It became a focal point for the residue of the event. Sometimes, in the space between the plinks, I would hear a faint, distorted echo of the Deputy S. hollow voice. Your noise other times, I would catch a whiff of that same sweet, rotten smell from the quarry, blooming in the still air of my house for just a second before vanishing. I started to dream. Not the chaotic psychic impressions I was used to, but a single, recurring dream. I am standing in a vast, gray plain under a sky the color of a day-old bruise. There is no wind, no sound, no life. In the distance stands a single leafless tree, and from one of its bare branches, a single drop of moisture gathers, swells, and falls. I watch it fall, and I know with dream certainty that when it hits the ground, something will happen. But I always wake up just before it lands. The plink of the real-world drop pulling me back. It was a warning, a countdown. The thing from the other side was probing the edges of my mind, testing my defenses, learning the rhythm of my thoughts. It was studying the very noise I had used against it. Ben showed up at my door one rainy afternoon, his patrol car idling in the lane. Didn't he have his son with him this time? His face was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped a small evidence bag. "We got a call," he said, stepping inside without being invited. The threshold felt less sacred now. An anonymous tip said to look in the library S after-hours drop box. He tossed the bag onto my kitchen table. Inside was a single, slim book. It was a volume of local poetry, the kind no one ever read. It was old, its cover frayed, but it was the bookmark that made my blood run cold. It was a photograph, a Polaroid, slightly blurred. It showed the interior of my house, taken from outside my kitchen window. My armchair was visible, empty, and on the floor beside it, a dark, damp spot on the wood, perfectly circular. The photo was taken last night. The book was open to a specific page, Ben said, his voice tight. A poem called The Listening Ground. I didn't need to read it. The message was clear. It was here. It was watching. The stillness wasn't just waiting out there in the void. It was mapping my world, learning its details, finding its points of entry. The dripping wasn't just a sound it was making. It was a sound it was teaching me to hear. A frequency it was using to tune my reality to its own. I looked from the photograph to Ben's terrified face, and then to the ceiling, from where that soft, patient blink continued its metronome beat. The battle wasn't going to be a repeat of the quarry. There would be no grand confrontation, no tear in the sky. The next attack would be quieter, more intimate. It would come from a place I considered safe. It would use the things I knew against me. It would come from inside. The rain picked up outside, tapping a frantic counter-rhythm to the deliberate plink from the ceiling. Ben followed my gaze upward, his jaw working. "What is that?" he asked. Though I could see in his eyes, he already knew it was more than a leak. "It's measuring," I said quietly, taking my dimensions. We stood there in the kitchen, two men surrounded by the evidence of an enemy that had no physical form. The photograph on the table was a violation, a declaration that the rules had changed. The stillness was no longer a storm on the horizon. It was the air in the room. Ben left with a promise to post a deputy outside, a gesture we both knew was useless. How do you arrest a silence? I locked the door behind him and returned to the main room. The armchair seemed to mock me, its familiar contours now a trap. I didn't sit. Instead, I walked to the spot on the floorboards shown in the photograph. I knelt and pressed my palm against the wood. It was dry and cool. There was no dampness, no physical source for the sound that was steadily drilling into my sanity. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair with the lights off, listening. The drip, drip, drip was the only constant. But in the spaces between, I began to hear other things. A faint scuttling in the walls, like rats or something with harder feet. A breath that wasn't mine. A soft exhalation from the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest. I kept my mind open, a raw nerve, ready to scream again if I had to. But there was nothing to push against. This was an insidious pressure, a slow filling of my space with its essence. By the third day, the effects were physical. A perpetual chill had settled in my bones, a cold that no amount of blankets or whiskey could touch. The house itself felt heavier, the walls leaning inward. When I looked in the mirror, my face seemed thinner, my eyes sunken, as if I were being slowly drained. I went to see Maeve. The library was a sanctuary of warm, yellow light and the comforting smell of paper. But as I walked through the stacks toward her office, I felt a new tension in the air. The books themselves seemed watchful. Maeve was at her desk, but she wasn't working. She was staring at her computer monitor, her face ashen. "Arlo," she said, not looking away from the screen. "It's been happening all morning." "What has?" "The catalog system. Look." She turned the monitor toward me. It showed the library's digital database. The search bar was empty, but titles were flashing across the screen one after another, appearing and vanishing in a ghostly procession. The Anatomy of Silence, Echoes in a Hollow Place, The Drowned Man's Journal. They were all real books in the library's collection, all related to themes of emptiness, loss, and quietus. "It's searching," I whispered. "It's not just searching," a voice said from the doorway. Jonah stood there, leaning on his cane. His usual scholarly calm was gone, replaced by a sharp urgency. "It's building a bibliography. For you." The three of us retreated to the back room. The familiar space felt different now, contaminated. Maeve had found the poetry book from the drop box in the stacks. It had been checked out 40 years ago and never returned. Until now. It's using the town's own history, its own stories, as a weapon, Jonah said. "It's learning how to speak to you in a language you'll understand." That photograph of your house, it wasn't just a threat. It was a reference. It's pointing you toward the poem, making you read it, making you think about the ground listening. The poem. I finally opened the book to the marked page. The listening ground was a short, bleak piece about a field that absorbed every sound ever made upon it, holding the echoes until one day it would decide to give them all back at once. The last line read, "And the sky will be torn by the weight of the unspoken." A cold certainty settled over me. The dripping in my house wasn't just a measure. It was a recording. It was absorbing the sound of my life, my fear, my solitude. It was filling a cup, drop by drop. And when it was full, it would tip it back out. It wouldn't just kill me. It would use every sound it had stolen from me, my voice, my footsteps, my heartbeat, as a tool to break back into the world. my own noise, weaponized. I left the library knowing what I had to do. I had to silence the drip, not in my house, but at its source. The quarry had been the site of the rupture, the place where the veil was thinnest. That was where the sound was being broadcast from. That was where I had to go to break the connection. I didn't tell Ben. I couldn't involve him in this. This was a fight for a different kind of weapon. As I drove toward the quarry as dusk began to fall, the dripping sound in my head seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if it knew its time was almost up. Or mine was. The fence around the quarry was cut, a fresh, sharp gash in the chain link. Someone or something was expecting me. I stepped through, into the growing dark, toward the edge of the abyss. The air at the quarry was different. It was thick and stale, as if it had been trapped here since the night of the ritual. The usual night sounds of crickets and frogs were absent. There was only the wind, a low moan that seemed to circle the great pit rather than pass through it, and the dripping. Here, it was not a solitary plink, but a chorus, a discordant water clock counting down from every damp rock face. I moved carefully along the rim, my flashlight beam cutting a frail path through the oppressive gloom. The ground was unstable, littered with loose shale that skittered away under my boots. I was looking for a focal point, a place where the unnatural sensation was strongest. My gift, now a raw and bleeding wound, pulled me toward the deepest part of the quarry, where a dark, rain-fed pool had collected at the bottom. A narrow, treacherous path led down. I took it, each step an act of will against the pressure that pushed me back. The feeling of being watched was absolute. It was the quarry itself that watched, every stone an unblinking eye. Halfway down, my light caught a glint of something pale against the dark rock. I knelt, brushing away dirt and gravel. It was a stone, but it had been worked, carved with the same angular, alien symbols I had seen on the ritual stones. It was warm to the touch. I found more of them, placed at intervals along the path, forming a faint, glowing trail downward. It was a new pattern, a new ritual laid over the scar of the old one. This was not about opening a gate anymore. This was about precision. This was about tuning. I reached the floor of the quarry. The pool lay before me, black and perfectly still, a mirror for the starless sky. The dripping sounds echoed from all around, converging here. This was the source. The water was not the source of the sound, it was the amplifier. I shone my light across the pool's surface. There were no ripples, despite the cacophony. Then the beam caught something suspended just beneath the water, pale and limp. It was a doll, a child's rag doll, its button eyes staring blankly upward, its yarn hair floating around its head like a halo. It was one I recognized. Lily Miller, the sheriff's youngest daughter, had been clutching it the last time I saw her in town. A cold fury cut through my fear. This was the intimacy I had dreaded. It wasn't just using the town's stories. It was using its people, their cherished objects, as components in its vile machine. As I stared at the doll, the dripping sounds suddenly synchronized. They became a single, steady beat, a slow, mocking heartbeat that vibrated through the soles of my boots. Plink, 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 and with each plink, the doll sank a little deeper into the black water. I knew what I had to do. I had to break the resonance. I had to shatter the amplifier. But my silent scream, the weapon I had used before, required life, chaos, noise. This place was a vacuum designed to suffocate such things. I had nothing to shout against. Then I remembered Jonah S. words. It hates a story that refuses to end. I closed my eyes, ignoring the sinking doll, ignoring the terrifying heartbeat of the quarry. I turned my focus inward, away from the oppressive silence, and sought a different sound. Not a scream, but a voice. I sifted through the psychic debris of my life, through the countless whispers I had spent a lifetime blocking out. I was not looking for power. I was looking for a person. I found her. A faint, frayed thread of memory, a ghost of a ghost. Mrs. Gable, my third-grade teacher, long dead. She had read to us every afternoon. Her voice had been soft and warm, a safe harbor. I grasped that thread, ignoring the cold that tried to sever it. I recalled the story. It was a simple one, a folk tale about a stubborn seed that grew into a great tree, its roots breaking apart a field of stone. I did not shout. I did not scream. I began to speak the story aloud. My voice was a raspy, broken thing, a tiny spark in an immense darkness. The words fell flat, swallowed by the quarry. The dripping beat continued, unwavering. But I kept going. I poured every ounce of feeling I had into the simple narrative, focusing on the warmth of Mrs. Gable S. voice, the safety of that classroom, the life of the story itself. I spoke of the seed pushing through the soil. I described the sun on its first leaf. The dripping faltered, just for a fraction of a second. It was working. I was not fighting the silence with noise. I was replacing it with something else, with narrative, with life. I raised my voice, the story gaining strength. I spoke of the tree's growth, its branches reaching for the sky. The synchronized beat broke apart, returning to a chaotic, scattered dripping. Above me, on the quarry rim, a pebble dislodged and clattered down the rock face. A real sound, an ordinary sound. I took a step toward the black pool, my voice growing louder, more confident. I was nearing the end of the tale. The tree was now mighty, its roots cracking the stone field, bringing life to a dead place. As I spoke the final words, I shone my flashlight directly down into the water. The doll was gone. In its place, for just a moment, I saw a reflection. Not of the sky, nor of my own face. I saw a vast, gray plain and a single leafless tree. And then it was gone. The quarry was silent, truly silent. The dripping had stopped. I stood there, trembling, the echo of my own voice the only sound in my ears. I had not won. I had bought another moment, another handful of days. I had told a story it didn't like, and it had turned its attention away. But as I climbed out of the pit, exhausted and hollow, I knew the price. I had given it a new story to study. Mine. And I I knew the next sound I heard in the quiet of my house would not be a drip. It would be the turn of a page. The drive home was a journey through a world that felt flimsy, a painted backdrop over a deeper, darker stage. The silence in my truck was no longer empty. It was thoughtful, considering. I had fed the stillness a story, and now it was digesting the meal. When I walked into my house, the air was different. The oppressive weight was gone, but so was the familiar comfort of home. It felt like a stage after the actors have left, the set waiting to be struck. I walked to the spot on the floor where the damp circle had been in the photograph. I knelt and pressed my ear to the wood. Nothing. No drip, no heartbeat, just a dry, hollow silence. But as I stood up, a sound made me freeze. It was a soft, rustling whisper. It came from the bookshelf in the corner. I approached slowly, my heart thudding against my ribs. The sound wasn't coming from a single book, but from all of them at once, a subtle shifting of paper and binding, as if unseen hands were gently tracing the spines. It stopped the moment I reached the shelf. I pulled out a book at random, a novel I'd read years ago. It fell open to a page near the middle. A single sentence was underlined in faint, almost imperceptible pencil. It read, "He knew the silence was not an end, but a pause." I dropped the book as if it had burned me. It was learning. It was annotating my life. The next few days were a study in subtle warfare. I would find my chair moved an inch from its usual spot. The coffee mug I always used would be waiting for me, clean and dry, but with a coldness that seeped into my bones when I touched it. It was curating my existence, arranging the props of my life into a new pattern, one that suited its narrative. Maeve called, her voice tight with a new fear. "Arlo, it's in the archives, the historical records." I was cross-referencing the Miller family history, and the dates have changed. Lily Miller's birth certificate. It now lists her date of birth as the day you went to the quarry. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. It wasn't just observing anymore. It was editing, rewriting. It was trying to weave me into the town's history, to make my confrontation at the quarry the foundational event for a new, terrible story it was composing. That night, the dream returned. I was on the gray plain under the bruised sky. The leafless tree was there, but now something hung from its branch. It was the rag doll swaying gently. And as I watched, the single drop of moisture gathered not on the branch, but in the center of one of its button eyes. It swelled, a perfect dark tear. This time, I did not wake up. I watched, helpless, as the tear grew heavy and fell. It hit the gray earth with a sound that was not a plink, but a word, a name, my name, Arlo. The voice was not the deputy's hollow echo. It was a dry, papery whisper, the sound of pages turning in a forgotten tomb. It came from everywhere and nowhere. I woke up sitting bolt upright in my chair, the name still hanging in the air of my living room. The house was dark, but from the kitchen, I heard a new sound, a soft, rhythmic scraping. forced myself to stand and walk to the doorway. A shaft of moonlight fell across the kitchen table. On it lay the volume of local poetry, open to the listening ground. And next to it, my own pen was moving, held by no visible hand. It was scratching a single word over and over in the margin of the page. Each stroke was deliberate, patient, a lesson being written. The word was listen. The pen stopped moving as I entered the room. It lay on the table, a simple, inert object. The word it had written, however, pulsed with a life of its own. The letters were not in my handwriting. They were sharp and angular, reminiscent of the symbols carved into the quarry stones. I stood there for a long time, watching the empty space above the pen, waiting for it to move again. It did not. The lesson was over for now. The command was given. Listen. So I did. I stopped trying to block out the subtle shifts in the house. I stopped fighting the chill. I sat at the table and let the new silence wash over me. At first, there was nothing but the frantic beating of my own heart. But as I forced myself to breathe, to be still, I began to hear it. Not a sound, but the shape of a sound. A negative space in the air. It was the echo of the dripping, but inverted. It was the memory of the drop, the space it had occupied before it fell. It was teaching me to hear the silence not as an absence, but as a substance. A terrible understanding dawned. My story at the quarry had not been a victory. It had been a response. I had accepted its premise, its invitation to a duel of narratives. I had stepped onto its stage and played my part, and in doing so, I had deepened the connection. It knew my voice now, not just as a weapon, but as a component. It was learning the grammar of my soul. The next morning, Ben came by. He looked more tired than I had ever seen him. He didn't step inside, just stood on the porch, his hat in his hands. "Lily's okay," he said, his voice rough. "She doesn't remember anything about the doll, but she's been sleepwalking. Her mother found her last night, standing in the hallway, just listening." He looked past me, into the dim interior of my house. "What did you do out there, Arlo?" "I told it a story," I said, the words tasting like ash. "It's not just you anymore," he said, his eyes full of a helpless anger. "It's using my little girl now. It's using all of us." He turned and walked away, leaving me with the weight of his accusation. He was right. The stillness was no longer a private haunting. It was weaving the entire town into its tapestry. I went back to the library, drawn by a need for some anchor in the shifting reality. Maeve was not at her desk. Jonah was there instead, sitting alone in the back room. The poetry book was open in front of him. "You've seen it," he said, without looking up. It wasn't a question. "It wrote in it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gnarled finger tracing the word in the margin. "It is a slow and patient scribe. It has all the time in the world." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were not those of a frightened man, but of a scholar who has found the subject of his life's work, however terrible it may be. "It is not trying to drive you mad, Arlo. Not exactly. It is trying to make you coherent, to make your story make sense within its own. Then what do I do? The question was a plea. You cannot refuse to play the game. The game is happening whether you consent or not. Your silence, your fear, your resistance, these are all just more paragraphs for it to use. He closed the book with a soft thud. You must become a better author. You must introduce a plot twisted cannot anticipate. A twist, I asked, feeling hopelessly outmatched. Chaos, Jonah said, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. It thrives on order, on pattern, on resonance. It hates a story that refuses to end, yes, but it despises a story that makes no sense. An anomaly, a contradiction it cannot file away. An idea, fragile and dangerous, began to form in my mind. It was not a story of life or growth. It was something else entirely. It was a nonsense rhyme my grandmother used to sing, a string of words that meant nothing, a melody that went in circles. It was the opposite of the stillness's meticulous, logical cruelty. As I left the library, I felt a new purpose, cold and sharp. I would not give it a good story. I would not give it a heroic tale or a tragic one. I would give it a joke, a riddle with no answer. I would fill its careful, listening silence with something it could not comprehend. Babbled. I walked home under a gray sky, practicing the old rhyme in my head. The air around me seemed to tighten, as if the town itself was leaning in, eager for my next move. It was listening. I could feel its attention like a physical pressure. It was ready for a story, for a new chapter in the saga it was writing. But I was not going to tell a story. I was going to tell a lie, a beautiful, meaningless, chaotic lie. And I was going to start right now. I stopped in the middle of the empty street, took a deep breath, and opened my mouth to speak. The first words were a dry croak, but they were not the rhyme. They were a question directed at the heavy air. "What color is Tuesday?" I asked, my voice ringing with a false confidence. The pressure hesitated. I felt a flicker of confusion in the stillness, a subtle rearrangement of the unseen attention focused on me. There was no answer, of course. There was only the expectant silence, waiting for the logic behind the query. I did not provide it. Instead, I began to sing, my voice gaining a little strength. It was my grandmother's rhyme, a sing-song cascade of absurdity. The cat wore boots of spider silk. The moon was made of cheese. The river flowed up the mountain to whisper to the trees. The words were childish, nonsensical. They defied cause and effect. They created a world where physics and reason were toys. A wind picked up, not a natural breeze, but a sharp, localized gust that whipped dust around my ankles. It felt like a reprimand. The stillness was rejecting the data. I kept singing, louder now, adding a jaunty, off-key tune. The king, he sold his kingdom for a pocketful of bees, and the stars, they danced a jig upon the quiet, listening seas. A window in the house across the street rattled violently in its frame. The sound was sharp, a crack of protest in the afternoon calm. I saw a curtain twitch, a pale face peering out, annoyed and confused by the sudden noise. A real person reacting to my disruption. Good. I walked on, becoming a one-man carnival of chaos. I skipped a few steps. I patted the trunk of an oak tree as if it were an old friend. I continued my song, inventing new verses on the spot, each one more ridiculous than the last. The shadow ate the sunlight, and it gave it quite a pain, so it coughed up a rainbow made of falling down the rain. By the time I reached my porch, the air was thick with a frustrated energy. The curated stillness of my home felt brittle, like a sheet of ice about to crack. I threw open the door and marched inside. I did not listen for subtle changes. I made my own. I knocked a book from a shelf deliberately. I hummed my nonsense tune while I filled the kettle, clattering the lid. I was not fighting the silence with noise. I was polluting it with meaninglessness. I was introducing a virus into its perfect, ordered system. That night, I waited for the dream. I expected the gray plain, the tree, the whispering of my name. But when sleep took me, I found myself somewhere else entirely. I was in a vast, dark library, but the shelves were made of twisted, petrified wood, and the books were bound in what looked like pale, stretched skin. The air smelled of dust and old ink. I was standing before a great lectern, and upon it was an open book. The text was written in the same angular script from the quarry stones. As I watched, a pen, much like my own, dipped itself into an inkwell and began to write. It was transcribing my song, but it was struggling. The words writhed on the page, the letters twisting and reconfiguring, unable to find a stable form. Spider silk became lyre milks. Pocket full of bees became locket full of seas. The narrative was breaking down. The pen scratched frantically, blotting the page, trying to force the nonsense into a coherent pattern. It couldn't. The ink smeared and pooled, a dark, chaotic mess. I woke not with a jolt, but with a slow, dawning realization. I was lying in my bed, and the first light of dawn was filtering through the window. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a machine that is jammed. It was the quiet of a scribe who has broken his pen. On my nightstand, my own pen lay snapped in two. The two pieces of the pen lay on the wood like a dead insect. The break was clean, as if made by immense, precise pressure. It was a message, an admission of irritation. I had not beaten it, but I had annoyed it. I had forced a flaw into its perfect record. A faint, acrid smell hung in the air, the ghost of spilled ink. I got out of bed, my body feeling lighter than it had in weeks. The oppressive sense of being curated was gone, replaced by a raw, unsettled feeling. I had traded a meticulous horror for a messy one. I had broken the rhythm, and now the silence was confused. When I went to the kitchen, the book of poetry was still on the table, but the word listen was gone. In its place was a large, dark stain that had seeped through several pages, obscuring the text. The stain was shaped vaguely like a hand, fingers splayed, as if trying to erase something. Maeve called just after sunrise. Her voice was shaky, but with excitement, not fear. "Arlo, you need to get down to the archives. Now." I found her surrounded by open boxes and loose-leaf files. She looked up at me, her eyes wide. "It's reversing," she said, holding out a brittle piece of paper. It was Lily Miller's birth certificate. The date changed back. "It's correct again. And look at this." She pointed to a ledger from the town's founding. The entry for the original quarry accident, the one that had started it all, was blurred. The names of the men who died were now illegible smudges. "It's losing its grip on the history," I said. A flicker of hope igniting in my chest. "Or it's erasing the parts that no longer fit its narrative," Maeve corrected, her scholarly mind already analyzing the phenomenon. "Your nonsense. It introduced a variable it couldn't process. It's trying to simplify the story, to cut out the contradictions. So my chaos had not destroyed the stillness. It had caused a system crash. It was rebooting, and in doing so, it was purging data. The thought was chilling. What else would it erase to maintain its coherence? I spent the day in a state of heightened alertness, waiting for its next move. The town felt different. A dog barked for no reason down the street. A child laughed, the sound sharp and unexpected. These ordinary noises felt like miracles, like life returning to a frozen limb. But the feeling was fragile. By evening, a new pattern began to emerge. It was not the dripping, not the heartbeat. It was a faint, rhythmic clicking, like two stones being tapped together. It seemed to come from the walls. It was slower, more deliberate than the dripping. It was the sound of something recalibrating, thinking. I knew the reprieve was temporary. I had bought us time, but I had also shown it a new weakness. Its obsession with order was its vulnerability. My grandmother's rhyme was a shield, but it wasn't a weapon. I needed something more. I needed to find a story so inherently chaotic, so fundamentally alive, that the stillness could not contain it. I thought of the reflection I had seen in the quarry pool. The vast, gray plain and the single, leafless tree. That was its world. A world of one story, one ending, endlessly repeating. I had to find a way to break that story at its source. Not with a shout or a silly song, but with a truth so disruptive it would shatter the foundation of its silence. Clicking in the walls grew a little louder. It was counting. It was measuring the silence between sounds. It was learning from its mistake. The game had changed. I had taught it about chaos, and now it was preparing to learn. The clicking followed me as I paced the living room, a metronome marking time in a composition I was no longer controlling. It was analyzing the chaos, dissecting it, learning its components. My victory felt hollow, a temporary glitch in a system that was already patching itself. I needed to go back to the beginning, to the quarry. The thought sent a jolt of pure fear through me, a cold sweat prickling on my skin. That was its heart, its stage. To go back was to walk directly into the narrative it was trying to build around me. But it was also the only place where the story might be unwritten. I waited until full dark. The clicking had subsided into an occasional, thoughtful tick, like a clock pondering its own purpose. I left the house without a plan, armed only with the memory of the nonsense rhyme and a desperate need to find a truth it couldn't digest. The road to the quarry was darker than I remembered, the trees pressing in like a silent audience. The air was thick and still, but it was a watchful stillness now, a predator that had been surprised once and would not be again. I could feel its attention on me, a focused pressure that made the back of my neck itch. I reached the chain-link fence. The hole I had cut weeks before was still there, a dark mouth in the wire. I ducked through, my shoes crunching on the gravel of the access road. The moon was a thin sliver, offering little light. The black expanse of the quarry pool lay ahead, a sheet of obsidian under the weak stars. I walked to the edge and looked down. My reflection was a distorted smudge on the dark water. I half expected to see the gray plain and the tree, but there was only the deep, waiting blackness. "All right," I whispered, my voice swallowed by the immense quiet. "You want a story? I'll give you one." But I didn't speak. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone I had picked up from my garden. I held it in my palm, feeling its ordinary, sun-warmed weight even in the night's chill. It was real. It was a piece of the world that was not part of its story. I didn't throw it. I simply opened my hand and let it fall. It struck the water with a sound that was impossibly loud in the silence. Plink. The sound echoed, not through the quarry, but through the substance of the silence itself. It was a clean, simple, physical sound. A stone hitting water. It was an event that required no interpretation, no narrative. It was just a thing that happened. For a moment, nothing. Then, the water where the stone had fallen began to ripple. But the ripples did not spread out in concentric circles. They moved inward, converging on the center of the pool. The water began to swirl, slowly at first, then faster, forming a vortex. The black water churned, and from its depths, a pale shape began to rise. It was not the rag doll. It was a hand. A pale, slender hand reaching up from the depths, as if grasping for air. It was followed by an arm, a shoulder. A figure was being expelled from the water, pushed out by the force of the simple, meaningless act I had performed. The figure slumped onto the rocky ledge at the pool's edge, coughing, gasping. Water streamed from dark hair, pooled on the stone. It was a young woman. She wore a simple, old-fashioned dress, now soaked and clinging to her. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. She looked at me, and I knew her. Not from a photograph or a town record. I knew her from the story, from the date on the birth certificate that had been changed, and then changed back. It was Lily Miller. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a real, breathing, shivering woman. The stillness had not just been weaving me into its story. It had been pulling her out of hers. My nonsense, my disruption, had broken the spell. It had rejected the contradiction, and in doing so, it had vomited her back into the world. She stared at me, her breath coming in ragged pants. "Where?" she stammered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "The tree. I was under the tree." The clicking sound returned then, not from the walls of my house, but from the very rocks around the quarry. It was no longer thoughtful. It was furious, a sharp, staccato rhythm of pure rage. The stillness had not just been annoyed. I had broken its narrative in a way it could not repair. I had not introduced chaos. I had introduced life, and it was very,